Hey there, tonight, we begin with something not so glamorous but quietly horrifying. Not dragons, not plagues, just blisters, iron discipline, and the unrelenting ache of standing guard in the rain for 12 hours straight. That's right, tonight. We're marching straight into the dirt-covered sandals of a Roman legionary. Before we start, take a second to get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket or let a fan hum gently in the background. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing, but only if you actually enjoy falling asleep to weird, underrated corners of history. Now, back to Rome. You've probably heard stories about the Roman army conquering Gaul, building roads, forming testudos, doing all that impressive stuff. But let's slow down and take a closer look. A much less glorious one, because tonight, we're not talking about strategy or glory or polished helmets. We're talking about what it actually felt like to live, day by day, as one of the most overworked, underrested, and occasionally underfed soldiers in ancient history. Why? Because in a world without padded socks, caffeine, or dental plans, a Roman legionary's worst enemy wasn't always the battlefield. It was boredom, blisters, dysentery, repetition, and the guy on watch before you who definitely didn't refill. The water skinner. The march never ends. Sandals, rations, and the pain of the Pax Romana. So, you've joined the Roman army. Congratulations, you're standing in a long, uneven line. The sun is already too bright and you're wearing wool under armor. A centurion is shouting something in Latin that you almost understand, and your right shoulder already hurts from the weight of your shield. From yesterday's march, or maybe just from existing in a time without ibuprofen. Welcome to the Roman Legion. This is not a story of glory. This is a story of routine, of aching feet, of grit under the fingernails and gravel in the bread. It's about the boring part of being in one of the most feared armies in human history. Because before the shields locked and the pylons flew, legionaries had to survive. Camp duties. And that's where we'll begin. A job for life, or until your feet give out. The Roman army, especially during the imperial period, wasn't made up of temporary draftees. These were full-time professional soldiers. Once you signed up, usually as a young man with few prospects, you were in for 25 years or 20-5 years. Most Roman legionaries didn't join for love of empire. They joined because they were broke, landless, or otherwise stuck, and they didn't become heroes overnight. First, they became recruits, raw, disoriented, and deeply unprepared. Your first lesson: how to march. Marching. Just marching, the backbone of the Roman military. The machine was not the sword. It was the calligator's open-toed, hobnailed sandals you see in mosaics. Stiff leather, iron studs, no padding. Now imagine wearing those while walking up to 20 miles a day, with roughly 90 pounds of gear strapped to your back. This wasn't just physical training, it was obedience training, discipline training, and yes, boredom training. Legionaries marched through forests, swamps, snow, desert. They marched in straight lines, often building roads as they went. They marched while singing cadence chants. They marched until their feet bled, and then they marched some more. This is the part no one paints on murals, the part where men relieve themselves in ditches, argue about which direction is north, or carry another soldier's pack because he twisted his ankle on a loose stone. And what did they call this delightful routine? Just the march. No frills, just forward movement all day, every day. Welcome to the camp. At the end of every day's march, did they get to collapse? No, they got to build a fort. Every single night after hours of marching, legionaries had to dig a trench, raise a wall of turf and stakes, and lay out a perfectly ordered rectangular military camp with precise streets, gates, tents, latrines, and storage areas. You didn't sleep until the camp was up. It didn't matter how tired you were. The Romans believed that an army's safety came from routine and order, and that included making temporary shelter look like permanent architecture. They weren't wrong. Many of these camp locations became permanent cities centuries later, but that doesn't help you now. As you're driving your shovel into dry soil with blistered hands, and you know what comes after dinner: night watch. The joys of guard duty. Night watch in a Roman camp was done in shifts. You stood, usually 2 hours at a time, rotating through 4 watches. You weren't just watching for enemies, you were watching for anything: a fire starting in the camp, someone sneaking out, wild animals, or worse, a superior officer doing rounds. Falling asleep on watch wasn't just frowned upon, it was punishable by death. This wasn't theoretical. If a soldier was caught dozing, the punishment was often fustuarium, a ritual, beating to death by his own unit. Supposedly it kept everyone alert, or terrified. Even if you stayed awake, the experience was miserable, cold, damp, boring, the torchlight flickering on your shield, the sounds of men snoring, insects buzzing, maybe your own thoughts reminding you that you miss your mother's lentils. Meals worth marching past. Now let's talk food. You may imagine Roman rations as olives, grapes, roasted meats. That's for senators. You're eating pulsar mush of lentils, barley, or spelt. Most meals were some form of bread, usually hard and stale, gruel grain boiled into paste, cheese, if you were lucky, dried fruit, occasionally water, mixed with vinegar posca to prevent it from going foul. No feasts. No variety, just nutrition at the lowest functional level. You often ate sitting on the ground, from your own wooden bowl, with your own spoon. There was no mess hall. No one served you. You ate when you could. And sometimes, you ate while marching. Also, digestion wasn't guaranteed. Latrines were communal, often shallow, and rarely cleaned, which brings us to ... illness, injury, and itching. Sanitation was poor. The Romans were ahead of their time in engineering, but they still lived with lice, intestinal parasites, dysentery, and constant skin irritation from unwashed wool and sweat. Minor wounds, blisters, scrapes, sunburn often turned serious. A pebble in your sandal could mean an infection. There were field medics, yes, but they worked without anesthesia or antisepsis. A cough could spread, a stomach cramp could be dysentery. And during long campaigns, sleep was a luxury you earned only after your tent was set, your gear was checked, and your guard duty completed. You are not a hero even if you survived basic training. You weren't a citizen hero, not yet. Most soldiers in the early empire were non-citizens. You only earned citizenship after completing your full service. If you died before then, too bad. No honor, no land, no pension. And even as a citizen, your rewards were often hypothetical. A small plot of land, maybe a few coins, your name on a tablet somewhere in a provincial temple. Most soldiers didn't become generals. They became old, tired, and haunted if they lived that long. And yet, Rome endured. Its armies held the frontiers, built its infrastructure, expanded its borders, and projected its power for centuries. But how disciplined ditches, and the tedium of eternal readiness. Let's be clear about something up front. Most of Roman military life was spent not fighting, but waiting to fight. And waiting, in Rome, didn't mean lounging around with your feet up. It meant digging, guarding, repairing, building, and occasionally, if you were lucky, not dying of boredom. It also meant navigating a world where punishment was always hovering, just behind your shoulder, like an invisible hand holding a vine staff. The legion's true weapon, discipline. If you picture the Roman military machine, you might think of sharp formations, gleaming shields, and rows of men moving in precise, terrifying unison. But what held it all together wasn't armor or numbers. It was discipline, called, regulated, and sometimes brutally enforced in Latin. This was called discipline, and it was enforced through a tightly controlled system of daily orders, ranks, routines, and expectations. Your gear had to be maintained, too standard. Your rations counted, your tent secured, your appearance neat, even when soaked with rain or coated in dust. Disobedience wasn't tolerated. Even minor infractions could be met with strict punishment. Let's say you dropped your helmet, left your sandals untied, or took too long in the latrine. You might be assigned extra digging duty, loss of rations, or flogging. And if you ran from battle, there was a punishment for that. To one of the most feared in Roman history, decimation. Not just a figure of speech. We use decimate today to mean destroy or eliminate. But in the Roman legion, decimatio had a very specific, horrifying meaning. If a unit was found guilty of cowardice, mutiny, or gross failure, the entire cohort might be punished by forcing 1 in every 10 soldiers to be executed by their comrades. That's right, the guilty didn't die alone. They were beaten to death by their own tentmates, using whatever tools were at hand, clubs, stones, bare fists. It wasn't just to punish, it was to humiliate, to restore order, to remind the rest that the unit survives together, or suffers together. Even the fear of decimation kept soldiers in line. And it was rare but not mythical. The art of doing nothing productively, but not all punishments were bloody. Often they were simply exhausting. One of the favorite tools of centurions was to assign busy work that had no obvious purpose but to remind you who was in charge. Examples included digging and filling ditches, repeatedly cleaning latrines that were already clean, sharpening stakes, or tools that didn't need sharpening, repacking your own gear, for instance. Standing at attention in full gear in the midday sun. These weren't just random annoyances. They were meant to instill obedience, strip away individuality, and make you ready at all times, because when something actually happened, when the order came to march, fight, or defend, you were already mentally trained to act without question, even if you were dead tired. Entertainment, or what passed for it. So, what did legionaries do when they weren't marching, digging, or being punished? Sometimes they had a few moments to themselves. In those rare intervals, they gambled with dice carved from bone. They played board games like la tranquil, a Roman version of chess or checkers. They sang rude songs, they sharpened weapons, they carved graffiti into walls or stone-screwed jokes, names, insults. Some learned basic writing or improved their Latin. Others spent time repairing their gear, cooking, or just sitting. Solitude was rare, privacy non-existent. So most soldiers bonded deeply with their contubernium, the 8-man squad with whom they shared a tent, meals, chores, and often a long stretch of years. If one of them failed, they all suffered, and that quiet solidarity, tired, dirty solidarity, is what kept the Roman army moving. Building Rome one fort at a time that many of Rome's greatest infrastructure achievements weren't built by engineers alone. They were built by soldiers, roads dug by legionaries, bridges assembled by the army, fortresses, aqueducts, temples watched if they were near a frontier or needed protection. It was the legion that did the lifting. Even Hadrian's Wall, that 73-mile fortification across northern Britain, was built by soldiers, one stone at a time, in wind and rain and cold, using the same discipline that held them in line on the battlefield. Some soldiers even became specialist carpenters, surveyors, stonemasons, blacksmiths, and were granted a bit more respect, not comfort, just respect. Because make no mistake, even the specialists had to carry their packs and stand watch when needed. Promotions, and what they cost, were their opportunities to rise in rank. Yes, but slowly, and with strings attached. You might become a deaconess responsible for your tent group, or rise to optio, second in command of a century. Eventually, you could become a centurion, a prestigious and dreaded figure who enforced discipline, carried a vine staff, and led from the front in battle. But these roles came with more risk, more responsibility, and often more enemies. A centurion who pushed his men too hard could be assassinated in a riot. An optio who failed to enforce order might lose his rank or worse. So many soldiers chose to stay where they were ranking. Anonymous, overworked, but alive. Foreign lands, foreign rules. Most legions served far from Rome. They were posted in distant provinces: Judea, Hispania, Britannia, Dacia, Egypt. And life in these places was strange. New foods, new diseases, local rebellions, freezing winters in Gaul, blistering heat in Syria. Sometimes the enemy wasn't a barbarian with a spirit, was malaria. Legionaries often had to learn local customs, languages, and survival strategies. They traded with locals, sometimes took local wives, and had children they couldn't legally acknowledge until retirement. They were outsiders, enforcers, builders, occupiers, and most knew they would never see Rome again. Retirement, or what was left of you after 25 years. A legionary who survived everything: disease, battle, punishment, frostbite, boredom, was granted land, a pension, and citizenship if he didn't already have it. Some used their pensions to buy farms, others settled in garrison towns. Some re-enlisted. Most had bad joints, poor eyesight, and scars that told stories no one wanted to hear. Rome rewarded service, but it didn't romanticize veterans. There were no medals, no parades, no triumphant returns, just quiet survival. And for many, that was enough. But why did they endure it? Why didn't more run? Why didn't more desert, riot, or revolt? Was it fear? Was it pride? Was it brotherhood? Or was it just that, for many, the life waiting outside the army was harder than anything inside it? Battlefields, broken bodies, and the end of the line, the trumpet sounds. Not the ceremonial kind, the harsh kind, the one that slices through early morning fog and makes a man's spine tighten. The kind that means it's time. You've trained for this moment. You've dug ditches, marched, sharpened blades, endured lice and dysentery, and your tent mate's terrible singing. And now, you're lining up full kit, gladius in scabbard, scutum in hand. The enemy is real, the earth is dry, and your heart is racing in a way that drills never prepared you for. Because today you're not building a road, you're fighting for your life. What battle really felt like? Let's be very clear. Roman battles were not glorious. They were loud, hot, crowded, confusing, and unimaginably violent. The Romans fought in tight formation, shoulder to shoulder, pressing forward like a living wall. You didn't see the whole battlefield. You saw the eyes of the man in front of you or behind you. You smelled sweat, leather, and blood. You heard screaming. You didn't move freely. You moved in rhythm. Your shield wasn't just protection, it was a tool to push your enemy back, pin them, exhaust them. Your short sword, the gladius, wasn't for dueling. It was for stabbing quickly, in the gut, in the thigh, in the neck, fast, efficient, brutal, and it worked. It worked for centuries. But that didn't make it pleasant. Casualties weren't just numbers in most Roman campaigns. The real killer wasn't the enemy. It was infection, starvation, weather, and poor medical care. A wounded soldier might live through a spear thrust but die a week later from fever. A cut on the foot could turn septic. A fractured bone could mean permanent discharge. Surgeons existed. They had tools, bone saws, clamps, cauterization rods, but they had no antibiotics, no anesthesia, and no guarantee of recovery. The army did care for its wounded. Soldiers were given rations, basic medical support, even retirement benefits in some cases. But there were no prosthetics, no trauma counselors, and no pause button. If you could walk, you marched. If you could hold a weapon, you fought. If not, you were left behind, and that was reality. Battle aftermath. Not the end you'd expect. Let's say your cohort survives the battle. You helped hold the line, maybe even advanced. The enemy retreated. The camp rejoices. What's your reward? Not a parade, not wine and applause. You're sent back to work. The wounded are buried or tended to. The dead are stripped and counted. Weapons are collected. Reports are written. And then you dig new latrines. Rebuild the ramparts. Dry your soaked tunic by the fire and prepare to move at dawn. There is no hero's feast. No medals. Just another march. And maybe, if you're lucky, an extra crust of bread. The march back never ends. Roman military campaigns were long. Months, sometimes years. A legion could be stationed in hostile territory with no clear timeline. Even after a victory, there was no guarantee of rest. You might be ordered to garrison duty in a new fort, or patrol a hostile border, or build yet another road because conquest was nothing without infrastructure. You saw your friends age beside you. You buried tent mates, you watched replacements arrive young, confused, the way you once were. And then, one day, you looked down at your own hands, and saw that you were no longer the young man with blistered feet. You were the old one giving the orders, checking the tents, explaining how to tighten a sandal strap properly, and the cycle continued. Retirement. What that meant if you made it to the end 25 years or more, you were honorably discharged. You received a diploma, bronze tablet stating your service and your right to Roman citizenship if you weren't born with it. You might be granted a small parcel of land in a province, or a lump sum payment of coins, but by then, your body was worn out. Your back ached in the mornings, your knuckles were swollen, your teeth fewer. And what did you do next? You farmed, maybe. Tended goats, married if you hadn't already. You taught your children discipline, how to tie a cloak, how to spot a weak shield line. You became what every empire quietly relies on, a tired, loyal man with stories nobody wanted to hear, who kept following rules long after there was anyone left to enforce them. A legion of ghosts. There were once hundreds of thousands of Roman soldiers, and yet only fragments of their stories survive. Names scratched into stone, lost dice under collapsed forts, shoe soles preserved in the mud, a knife handle with initials, a rude poem etched into a latrine wall. They didn't leave behind epic poems. They didn't write history. They built it in roads, in walls, in bones, buried beneath fields that are now farmland or parking lots. And if they left behind anything louder than a whisper, it was the empire itself. So, could you last a day? Maybe you could. Maybe you could march under a hot sun, carry 90 pounds, survive on stale barley, dig a trench, and sleep on gravel just to wake and do it all again. Maybe you could hold your shield straight through 2 hours. Of what? Help pitch a tent, fold your cloak neatly, sharpen your blade, and stand in formation without moving. But could you do it not just for a day but for 9,000 days? Because that's what it took not to win a war, not to make history, just to survive as a Roman legionary. And if nothing else, maybe tonight, as you rest comfortably in your own bed, you'll remember the silent footsteps of tired soldiers marching forever down roads they built with their own hands, never knowing that someday someone might whisper their story just before falling asleep. The garderobe keepers where nobility went. Someone had to follow. Let's begin with a question most history books quietly avoid. Where did medieval people go? Castles are often imagined as noble places, stone walls, stained glass, flickering torches, roasted meats, and royal decrees echoing through echoing halls. But what about after the feast? After the ale and bread and fatty meat and boiled root, vegetables had run their course. Tonight, you're going to follow the person who handled that because someone did. Someone always did. The garderobe more than just a shoot. First, let's understand the structure. If you lived in a medieval castle and nature called, you didn't head out to the fields or the woods like a common peasant. You headed for the garderoba, small stone room, often built high on the outer wall of the castle, with a simple wooden bench and a hole that opened to the air. You sat, you relieved yourself, and gravity did the rest. Some garderobes dropped waste into the castle moat, others led to cesspits, streams, or if someone was very unlucky, into the heads of those below. It wasn't private, it wasn't clean, and it definitely wasn't odorless. The word garderobe literally means to guard one's robe. Nobles would sometimes hang their clothes in there, because the strong smell was believed to repel lice. Imagine that, a room so rank it served as insecticide, and someone, usually a lower-ranking servant, was responsible for making sure it didn't overflow. The attendants in the shadows, these individuals went by no official title. Some were known simply as scourers or nightmen. In smaller households, there were kitchen hands who had drawn the short straw. In larger estates, there might be one servant assigned permanently to privy duty. Their job was as follows: empty and clean chamber pots, clear garderobe chutes of blockages, maintain wooden seats and privacy screens, scrub floors with vinegar, lye or ashes, sprinkle herbs to combat the stench, lavender, rosemary, or sometimes dried moss, remove waste from collection pits and dispose of it off-site. And all of this often done under torchlight, in cramped stone passages slick with damp and shadow. Chamber pots, the bedroom companion. Now let's move from castles to homes. Most people didn't have garderobes. Instead, they used chamber pots, simple bowls made from ceramic, pewter, or wood. These were kept beside the bed, especially for nighttime use. A servant, usually female, would collect these pots early in the morning and carry them to a time down narrow stairwells to be emptied. They were poured into street drains, cesspools, or open ditches in many towns. The morning soundscape included the splash of chamber pots and the shouted warning, "Guard is low, watch out," for the water, which, yes, may be the root of the English word loo. Now imagine being the person who had to carry dozens of these each morning. Cold hands, splashes, slippery cobbles, the smell of onion and ale and last night's regrets. And no, gloves were not standard. Tools of the trade. You might be wondering that they have tools for this. Yes, of a sort. Pail hooks for lifting and emptying cesspit barrels, rags and moss for wiping and scrubbing flat, wooden scrapers for hardened deposits, cloth masks soaked in vinegar or herbs, primitive but sometimes helpful bucket of lime for scattering into waste piles, reducing smell and slowing rot. Still, the job was often done with bare hands, or hands wrapped in scraps of cloth. You didn't do this job because you loved it. You did it because someone had to, and because you weren't a noble, or a craftsman, or a clerk, and because sometimes cleaning filth was safer than starving street sanitation in town. This job took on a more public form. Gong farmers were hired by cities to clean out latrines and cesspits. They worked at night, carrying heavy buckets of human waste through narrow alleys, sometimes waist-deep in slurry, were paid reasonably well but shunned socially. People crossed the street to avoid them. They were considered unclean, even cursed. And yet, they kept the towns from disease and collapse if they failed to show up, or if they struck for better wages. The effects were immediate. Gutters overflowed, pits reeked, illness spread, and yet they were never celebrated. Their names aren't remembered. Their homes were on the outskirts, their clothes always stained. The work they did, quietly and nightly, literally kept medieval society running. Cleanliness wasn't about comfort. Modern hygiene is about health, comfort, and personal dignity. But in medieval times, cleanliness was more ritual than rational. People didn't wash often. Water was often cold or contaminated. Soap was a luxury. Instead, they used cloths, vinegar, or simply changed clothes more often than they bathed. So, the bathroom attendant, whether in a castle or a cottage, wasn't trying to keep things sterile, just bearable. Their job was not to make a place clean, but to make it less revolting than it could have been. And that meant scraping dried filth off stone, pouring buckets of urine into alleys, and, if needed, burning straw to mask the smell. The emotional toll. This wasn't just physically grueling. It was emotionally isolating. To smell constantly, to be the last servant in the hall, to be called by your job and not your name. There are records of complaint servants writing letters begging for reassignment, others who fled their posts, leaving chamber pots unemptied for days. But there are also records of those who did it for years, quietly, dependably, fading into the fabric of the household. You won't see their portraits in castles, but if you step close to the garderobe chute at a ruin today, and notice how neatly it's built, how well the stone is worn, you might be looking at their work. A day ends in ash and silence. At the end of a long day, the privy keeper would return to their quarters, often a small room near the kitchens or stables. They might wash their hands in cold water, scrape out their fingernails with a knife, and light a single tallow candle. They'd sleep alone, far from the rest of the staff, to avoid the smell, and they'd rise before dawn the next morning to empty the chamber pots again. No one praised them, but without them, the palace would collapse into chaos. But here's a question. In a world that valued nobility, poetry, chivalry, why did no one sing songs for the people who kept it all clean? Why is it always the knight on horseback and never the woman with the chamber pot? What does that say about the kinds of stories we choose to remember? Gong farmers, nightmen, and the cities that couldn't afford to smell it set the scene. The year is 1353. You're in London, near the banks of the Thames. The streets are narrow, the air thick with smoke and the hum of summer flies. A layer of dirt cakes every stone. And just behind the local church, beneath a small wooden grate, is something no one speaks of by name. A sack 40 feet deep, slowly filling, and someone, somewhere, has to climb in because the city doesn't clean itself. Gong farmers, men of the muck by the 14th century. Large cities had grown beyond what their early planners imagined. Stone houses stacked tightly in sparth houses, bakeries, alehouses, all generating waste, and not just scraps of bread or bones from butchers, taught human waste. Tons of it. Enter the gong farmer, a term used primarily in England for a man who cleaned out cesspits, and privis gong comes from the Old English gang, meaning to go, and farmer meant not a grower of crops, but someone who worked a fixed job on contract. A cesspit might be located beneath a tenement, behind a tavern, or even directly under a row of public latrines. These deep, narrow pits filled slowly over months, sometimes years, until they needed to be emptied. And when they did, it was always at night. The night soil shift night was safer, cooler, less shameful. Gong farmers began work after sundown, carrying long-handled buckets, ropes, and winches, wooden shovels, cloth masks soaked in vinegar or urine, and the courage to descend into toxic blackness. Some wore oiled leather or wool soaked in tallow. Many stripped to underclothes, knowing they'd burn them later. They climbed into cesspits by ladder, sometimes chest-deep in excrement, and shoveled the contents upward to be bucketed out, poured into carts, and taken outside the city. It was dangerous, not metaphorically, literally. A breath away from death's zest, but were filled with more than just smell. They contained methane, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide, which could render a man unconscious in minutes, or kill him on the spot. There are recorded incidents of gong farmers dying in pits, slipping, fainting, or being buried alive when walls collapsed. Still, the job paid well. In some cities, up to 6 pence a night, enough to support a small family, but they couldn't spend it freely. Gong farmers were often banned from living within city limits, restricted to slums or outskirts. They ate alone, bathed last, and were buried in unmarked graves. To most, they were invisible, necessary, and entirely unwanted. The smell that built a system. You might wonder, why didn't cities build sewers? They tried. Roman cities had underground drainage, and medieval engineers inherited some of those ideas, but most medieval towns were too crowded, too underfunded, and too religiously cautious to tamper with the ground on many places. Waste was simply dumped into rivers, gutters, or open fields. Streets had central channels called kennels where runoff flowed. Rain helped. So did luck. Eventually, laws were passed. No dumping chamber pots from upper windows after sunrise. No placing dung heaps within 10 feet of a neighbor's door. No letting pigs root in public drains. These were loosely enforced, but still there was an attempt at structure. And at the heart of it, trudging quietly in the dark, were the Gong farmers and night soil men. What did they do with it? You might ask. Where did it all go? In most cities, waste was carted out to dunghills, fields, or marshy areas known as lestals. These were temporary dump sites. Bought from there, the waste was often sold as fertilizer to farmers after aging, dumped into rivers, burned if dry, or simply left to rot on the edge of town. Some cities developed waste routes, paths where carts passed at regular intervals. These were avoided by day and traveled only by torchlight. The journey was treacherous, sloshing buckets, broken wheels, angry neighbors, but still, they came back every night. The smell of invisibility. What's striking about the night soil profession is how thoroughly it has been scrubbed from collective memory. Medieval chronicles list births, deaths, church events, but rarely cesspit schedules. Paintings of bustling medieval towns don't show the nightmen. No one carved reliefs of their carts. No bard sang of the man who kept the tavern's drains flowing. But they were there. They are buried beneath London's clay, Paris's catacombs, Prague's foundations. Their work literally formed the compost of modern cities. Their reward, silence, and coins that stank. Other cities, same job. This wasn't just English. In Paris, they were called vidangers or fusoliers. In Florence, netfus. In Rome, waste was gathered into pig-knot-covered jars, buried under latrines, and emptied by hand. Each city had its own system, but the job was universal. Work at night, avoid the law. During the day, empty, carry, dump, repeating some cases. Convicts were given this task as punishment. In others, it was inherited, passed from father to son, each generation earning coin at the price of dignity. Still, the job was stable, essential, and unlikely to be replaced by automation in the 14th century. The quiet resilience what fascinates historians today is how long these systems lasted. London's last recorded night soil removals occurred in the 19th century. That's 500 years of nightly muck, mostly undocumented. And through it all, the workers developed tricks: how to read a cesspit wall to tell if it would collapse, how to recognize the early signs of gas exposure, how to silence the sound of carts so they didn't wake the sleeping townspeople, how to make vinegar cloths last longer by soaking them twice, how to time a load so they could get home before dawn. These were the secrets passed quietly, like guild knowledge between men with cracked hands and stained boots. They didn't leave memoirs, but they left behind a cleaner world. Just a whiff away today. When you flush a toilet, you don't think of them, but for hundreds of years, in every great city, someone was out there wading, lifting, heaving, scrubbing so that life could move on without drowning in its own filth. So next time you pass a storm drain or see a manhole cover, ask yourself who built the system beneath your feet, and more importantly, who kept it running when no one else dared to look. The last of the nightmen, from medieval sludge to modern sewers. The story doesn't end in the Middle Ages. In fact, for many cities, the peak of the night soil profession came centuries later, not in castles or thatched cottages, but in the brick and soot-stained alleys of industrial Europe. Even as technology advanced, the waste kept coming, and still, someone had to carry it away. The long shadow of the chamber pot that start in the 1700s. In cities like London, Edinburgh, and Dublin, chamber pots were still in every home. Toilets existed in theory, but they were rare, crude, and required expensive plumbing. Instead, most people continued to do what they always had: use a pot or pan in their bedroom, empty it into the street gutter, or leave it for someone else to collect this. Someone else was still the nightman. And though the name had changed, the job had not. They wore canvas smocks, leather boots, scarves tied across their faces. They worked from dusk till dawn, hauling barrels of waste up rickety stairwells, into carts, and out beyond the city walls. Sometimes they operated in teams. One man inside the house, one on the cart, one managing the horses, and all of them paid to disappear before sunrise. The Privy War be the 1800s. Cities were drowning in filth. Populations exploded. Tenements stacked people on top of one another, 6 families to a floor, each with their own chamber pot. Prives in courtyards overflowed. Cesspits turned rancid. Flies swarmed. Disease spread in London. It was cholera. In Paris, Typhus, in Dublin. Dysentery. The connection between poor sanitation and illness was known barely, but implementation was slow. City governments debated the cost of underground sewers, while the nightmen kept working. They were both vital and reviled. Doctors blamed them for spreading disease. Tenants blamed them for being late. And yet, if they failed to show up for even 1 week, the entire city would stink of human waste, sewers, and the death of a profession. Eventually, something changed. In London, the Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames became so foul that Parliament could no longer function, forced action. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette began constructing the first modern sewer system. Brick-lined tunnels, iron gates, gravity-fed flow. That was revolutionary. But it took decades to complete, and until then, nightmen were still needed. They worked alongside engineers, carting away waste from neighborhoods not yet connected to the mains. But slowly, as pipes replaced pits, the night soil trade faded. Some workers adapted, becoming sewer inspectors, maintenance hands, or builders. Others were simply let go. Their job had disappeared, and no one threw a parade. Forgotten lives, buried stories. If you go digging through city records, you might find hints of them. A note in an 1812 ledger paid nightmen for removing 3 barrels to 6 shillings. A court case from 1784. Nightman struck by resident over spilled waste. A diary entry. Could not sleep. Nightmen rattled buckets past midnight again, but most of the time, they were invisible. Not because people couldn't see them, but because they didn't want to. Society doesn't like to remember who carries its waste, or who keeps the filth from overflowing. It prefers kings, queens, and inventors. But beneath the palace floors, someone always had to shovel modern eco-so as it over. Not entirely. Even today, waste workers continue the tradition, modernized, yes, but still carrying the same burdens. Sanitation workers, sewer inspectors, septic tank drivers, they no longer wade into pits with vinegar cloths, but they still face dangerous gases, back-breaking libolo social status, and little recognition. And when disaster strikes, a flood, a clog, a collapse, they're still the first to enter the muck. You can see them if you look. Orange vests, flashlights, gloves, and tired hands. They don't ask for thanks, just a paycheck, and maybe a little space on the street to do their job. A final reflection in the dark the next time you walk into a clean bathroom, flush a toilet, or stroll a city street that doesn't reek of rot and run off. Pause. Someone, centuries ago, walked through that same space with a bucket sloshing beside them, thinking only of how many houses remained on their route. They wore stained boots. They breathed through rags. They built the foundation of modern life. And they did it in silence. We call them nightmen gone farmers, privy workers, but maybe we should call them what they were. The quiet engineers of civilization, the woman in the water leech's blood, and the cure that clung to tight. Let's begin in 1823, in the marshes of Westmoreland, England. It's barely dawn, and a woman named Anne is already knee-deep in cold water. The air smells of peat and wet grass. Her dress is tied high, her feet are bare, and she's staring at the ripples, watching for movement. And then she steps, slowly, carefully, because every step may bring a soft, squirming tickle, and a dark streak of blood rising in the water. She is a leech collector, and she is the first step in your grandfather's medical treatment. The craze for bloodletting in the 18th and 19th centuries, medicine across Europe and beyond embraced a belief as old as Hippocrates, that illness came from imbalanced humors, too much heat, too much bile, and most often too much blood. So what was the treatment? You bled. Doctors lanced arms, cut ankles, sliced gums, tapped behind the ears, and when they didn't want to use a blade, they used leeches. The humble medicinalist, the medical leech was seen as a gentler, more refined option. It was applied to the skin, left to latch on, and then removed once full, sometimes by fire, sometimes by force. Doctors used them to treat everything from headaches to fevers, coughs to melancholy, even nervous disorders and swollen eyes. And the more fashionable the patient, the more leeches were required. The people who supplied them. But here's a part often left out of the textbooks. Where did all those leeches come from? The answer lies in the swamps, the bogs, the slow-moving streams and brackish ponds. There, in the mud, were the collectors, often poor, often female, often unpaid. In England, in Ireland, in France and Prussia, the job fell to peasants, widows, and children. Why? Because they were considered disposable, or at least replaceable. A strong man was needed for the farm, but an old woman, a barefoot girl, they could collect leeches. How leeches were caught: you didn't trap them with bait, you didn't net them, you offered yourself. The method was simple. Wade into the water, slowly stand still, waitlet. The leeches come then, latched on ankles, calves, even thighs, and began to drink. A single leech could draw several teaspoons of blood. The collector waited until several were attached, then pulled them off gently, one by one, placing them in a clay jar or wooden bucket. Each jar might hold a dozen, and a good day's work, despite cold, rain, and exhaustion, might bring in just a few shillings. Some leechers tried using animals, old horses, dogs, or even goats to lure the leeches instead, but most collectors used the same bait, day after day, themselves. The pain, the blood, the infection here is what people forget about this job. It wasn't just disgusting, it was dangerous. Leeches didn't just bite and fall off. They secreted anticoagulants, which meant the bleeding continued for hours afterward. Open wounds, multiple punctures, and cold, dirty water made infection common. Many collectors suffered chronic anemia from blood loss, ulcers, and sores on their legs, infections from bacterial-laced medan. In rare cases, sepsis or death. There are accounts of women collapsing after hours of work, pale, dizzy, with blood dripping down their legs. But the worst part, there were no protections, no laws, no gloves, no shoes, just the jar, the water, the cold dot, and the slow wade into the next pond. A growing market, a shrinking source as bloodletting became more popular. Leech populations collapsed on Britain. The wild medicinal leech was nearly extinct by the mid-1800s. France too saw massive declines. Leeches were overharvested, streams polluted, and wetland habitats drained for farmland. Collectors had to travel farther, wade deeper, and often return with fewer leeches and more wounds. This scarcity only increased the market value. Apothecaries paid more, doctors bought in bulk, and smugglers entered the game. Some leeches turned to black market collecting, sneaking onto estates or across borders with bags of mud and blood. Others tried farming leeches in barrels or ponds, but the process was slow. Leeches don't breed quickly, and so the work continued, one leg, one bite, one jar at a time. Who were these women? We know some of their names. Dotton Atkins of Cumbria was said to carry 6 jars a day, even into her 60s. Mary Heald from Lancashire had one leg crippled from chronic infection. Biddy O'Neill in County Clare was blinded in one eye after a leech latched too close during a storm. But most were unnamed, recorded only as leecher, swamp woman, marsh girl. They were neither saints nor martyrs, just resilient and very, very tired. The blood behind the science. By the late 1800s, the medical establishment began to change. Germ theory took hold. Hospitals became sterile. Bleeding fell out of favor, replaced by surgery, antiseptics, and better diagnostics. Doctors began laughing at bloodletting. Apothecaries stopped ordering leeches. Collectors found themselves jobless. Some tried selling their leeches at market stalls, offering them to curious travelers as novelties. Others simply let them go back into the streams, and many too old, too injured, just faded into poverty. But here's the strange thing. Why, with all our progress, do leeches still appear in some hospitals today? Why did we bring them back, centuries later, in modern medicine? And what might that say about all the people who kept them alive through blood, mud, and forgotten labor? Leech, mania, apothecaries, aristocrats, and the business of bloodletting. We begin in Paris, 1830. In a fashionable townhouse not far from the Seine, a young boy is being treated for a cough. He lies in bed, weak from fever, as the physician opens a velvet-lined case. Inside 6 live leeches, fat and sluggish. The boy's mother watches nervously. The doctor takes a warm cloth, presses it to the boy's neck, and places 3 leeches near his jawline. The creatures latch on within seconds. Why? Because in this moment in history, the leech is not just a tool. It's a trend, a status symbol, and somehow a cornerstone of European medicine. From folk medicine to fashionable cure, bloodletting was ancient. But in the 18th and early 19th centuries, it became institutional. Doctors in France, Germany, England, and Russia embraced leeches with remarkable enthusiasm. They called it revulsion therapy, to draw blood away from a problem area derivation, to reduce internal inflammation by removing fluids, and sometimes simply heroic medicine, doing something visibly dramatic to cure invisible problems. Headaches, apply leeches to the temples. Swollen legs, leeches to the thighs. Sore throat, leeches inside the mouth, yes, inside the scale of demand. By 1833, France alone was importing over 40 million leeches per year, Britain several, a million more. Hospitals used them by the hundreds per week. Elite families kept them in their homes, in glass jars called leech tubes, sealed with cork and linen. Some doctors carried them in breast pockets, warming them with their own body heat. Pharmacists became middlemen, storing leeches in stone basins, with sand and water, feeding them with fresh blood, and selling them by size and vigor. There were guides to leech storage, manuals on best practices, even leech wranglers who specialized in calming the creatures before application. The leech wasn't just a remedy, it was an economy. The business of bleeding by the polished clinics and apothecary jars were the muddy hands of collectors. Farmers turned to leech collection as a side income. Swamp areas were leased to commercial harvesters. In Ireland, entire families waded into bogs at dawn, collecting for brokers who traveled from town to town. In Germany and Poland, large estates stocked artificial ponds with wild leeches. These ponds were tended like vineyards, weeded, guarded, carefully managed. That there were rules: never collect during spawning, seed and rotate. Ponds for sustainability, use animals when human collectors grew ill. Still, demand outpaced nature. By the 1840s, entire species of wild leech were under threat. Local governments issued licenses, some passed leech preservation acts. But for the poor woman in the fen, waist deep and shaking with fever, the only rule that mattered was how many she could collect before sunset, who bought them. Surprisingly, leeches weren't just for the sick. In many cities, barbers doubled as bloodletters. You could walk into a shop for a shave and leave with 2 leeches on your temple and a cloth bandage around your wrist. Leeches were used to treat excess emotions, heated minds, translation, anxiety or mania, wandering womb. A bizarre but common diagnosis in women: hemorrhoids, boils, migraines, and spiritual imbalance. Even animals were bled. Horses, cattle, dogs. A veterinarian might apply leeches to a horse's gums or inside its ear canal. And aristocrats, well, they used them preemptively. A French noblewoman might receive a monthly treatment to maintain calm. A Russian officer might keep a private stash in his quarters for morale. The logic was, why wait to get sick when you could bleed now and avoid it altogether? A job falling out of favor as cities grew more industrial. Leech collectors became both more visible and less welcome. In rural towns they were seen as eccentric, but in cities they were an embarrassment. Dirty, wet, old-fashioned. Collectors were sometimes banned from marketplaces for smelling of swamp water. Others were arrested for trespassing on private ponds or cutting fences around estate bogs. They responded as they always had, with quiet endurance. Some began breeding leeches in barrels behind their homes. Others formed small cooperatives sharing transport, guarding routes, but more often they were simply phased out. By the late 1800s, collectors were called relics, moss, folkbog. Women, the bleeding ghosts, an eerie nickname recorded in rural French lore. Medicine turns a corner as medical science advanced. Germ theory, antiseptics, and internal diagnostics began to replace guesswork. The microscope replaced the leech. By 1890, the leech industry had crashed. Doctors began publishing papers mocking past practices. Leech jars were tossed out. Medical schools removed bloodletting from their curricula. Collectors were left behind. Their skills, once life-saving, were now a curiosity. The few remaining suppliers turned to niche markets: folk healers, rural hospitals, and a few stubborn nobles who refused to give up the old ways. But the golden age of leeching was gone, and yet not gone forever. Today, leeches have returned. Modern medicine has found real value in leech saliva, which contains powerful anticoagulants and painkillers. In microsurgery, leeches are used to restore blood flow in delicate reattachments, ears, fingers, even noses, and with them has come a small, quiet revival of the leech farm, this time clean, controlled, and scientific. But the leech collector, the woman in the swamp, she's nowhere to be found. So what happened to all the Ann Atkinses and Mary Healds of the leech world? What does history do with workers it no longer needs? And what remains when the bog has been drained? Draining the bog, the rise, fall, and return of the medicinal leechlets begin in a hospital not centuries ago, but just a few years back. A young woman has just undergone reconstructive surgery. Her finger, severed in an accident, has been painstakingly reattached. The sutures are perfect, the bones are lined, but her surgeon frowns. The blood isn't circulating. The veins are too narrow, too damaged, so a nurse walks in with a small glass vial. Inside, a dark brown leech coils lazily, and just like that, centuries later, the leech is back. A creature reborn. Though medical bloodletting fell from favor in the late 1800s, the science of leeches didn't disappear entirely. Some physicians in Eastern Europe and Russia continued studying leech saliva, known as Hiru. They found it prevented clotting, reduced inflammation, contained mild anesthetics, encouraged blood flow in damaged tissue. By the 1960s and 70s, plastic and microvascular surgery had advanced dramatically, but one challenge remained: restarting circulation in reattached limbs. Enter the leech. It could do what machines couldn't: gently draw blood, relieve pressure, and release therapeutic saliva into hard-to-reach places. In 2004, the FDA approved the use of leeches in American hospitals as medical devices. From bogs to biolabs, but modern hospitals no longer rely on barefoot women in muddy fens. Today's medicinal leeches are bred in sterile leech farms, mainly in Wales Biofarm, one of the world's largest producers. France Rouchan, specialized labs across Europe and Asia. These facilities use controlled water systems, strict feeding cycles using blood-soaked membranes, and veterinary supervision. Leeches are shipped in custom containers, labeled like organ transplants. They arrive in hospitals, quiet, ready. Once used, they are humanely disposed of, never reused. It's cleaner, safer, and oddly detached. A vanishing collector. But as leeches entered the laboratory, the collectors vanished. No one today waits in a bog for a leech to find them. No one counts their bites in silver shillings. No one, least of all the surgeons using modern leeches, remembers the girls who once fed whole cities with blood drawn from their legs. Their tools, wooden buckets, jars, leeching spoons, now sit in medical museums, mostly unlabeled. Their names, fewer than a dozen, remain in historical records. They weren't seen as scientists, or healers, or even professionals. Just wet silhouettes in the fog. Lessons from the leech. The story of leeches isn't just about blood, it's about how medicine remembers its tools but forgets its workers. It's about how science advances on the backs of labor quiet, repetitive, and often unpaid. And it's about how some cures come at a cost that was never measured in coin, but in blood loss, cold feet, and the ache of standing still. The medical world moved on. The collectors did not. The strange modern revival. Today, leeches are used in plastic surgery, skin graft, recovery, attaching to ears, fingers, noses, treating venous congestion in delicate tissues. They've even been explored in arthritis relief, varicose, vein therapy, and migraine treatment, though evidence is mixed. But there is a certain irony in it all, that leeches once discarded as medieval nonsense are now regulated by modern pharmaceutical standards, that their once maligned effects have found new clinical justification, and that the people who kept them alive, those who bled, sickened, and aged in the marsh, were never invited back. The creature returned. The collector did not. The last steps into the water. Imagine her now, a woman in her 60s, shawl pinned to her shoulder, stepping carefully into the bog. The water is cold. The morning is still, and she's waiting for the first tickle of motion on her calf. She does not know what an FDA is, or what germ theory means. She knows only that the apothecary asked for 24 leeches by dusk, and her ankles are already bleeding. That's all. No plaque, no monument. Just a soft ripple behind her as the first leech latches on, and somewhere, nobleman breathes easier. So next time you walk through a hospital, past sterile trays and quiet nurses, remember that centuries ago, someone stood in a swamp to make those tools possible. Not with machines, not with science, but with silence, mud, and blood. A bite for the departed. The meal at the edge of salvation. Let's begin in 18th century Wales. A man has died in his bed quietly, without fanfare. His family, poor and worn thin by winter, gather around the hearth. The body has been washed, the eyes closed, coins placed over the lids, and now they wait. Not for a priest, not yet. They wait for him, the senator. He is not holy, not respected, but he is necessary because the man who died suddenly, without confession, without communion, without the final rites, and someone, they believe, must help his soul cross over. The origin of the senator was not ordained, not trained, not officially sanctioned by church or crown. He was part of folk belief, woven into rural communities in Wales, England, and parts of Scotland and Ireland from the 1600s through the early 1800s. The concept was simple. So, when a person died, their sins remained with the body. If they had not received absolution, those sins risked haunting the family, the village, or the soul itself. To remove them, someone needed to take them on. And the method, a meal eaten over the corpse alone. What did they eat? The ritual varied by region, but the most common practice was this. A piece of bread, sometimes cheese or cake, was placed on the chest or face of the deceased. A mug of ale, cider, or milk might be poured. The senator entered usually in silence, and sat near the body. He, or in rare cases, she would recite a short line. I give easement and rest now to thee, dear man. Come not down the lanes or in our meadows. Trouble us not, nor thy kin. Then, the bread was eaten, the drink consumed. The idea was simple. The food had absorbed the sins, and by swallowing it, the senator took them into himself. Why would anyone do this? Senators were not revered. In fact, they were often feared. They were seen as spiritually dangerous, tainted by the sins of hundreds, perhaps thousands. Children were told not to look them in the eye. Villagers crossed the street to avoid them, but in every community, someone still agreed to take the role. Usually an outcast, a widower, a beggar, a man with no land, no name, and little to lose the pay. A few coins, a loaf, a drink, and even that, only if the family could afford it. So why do it? Because, in a world where religion was constant but access to priests was scarce, the senator provided a last chance, a final comfort for grieving families, and for the senator himself, perhaps a strange form of belonging. The ritual of shame. The ritual had no legal standing, no liturgical blessing. It was seen by the church as superstitious, even heretical, but it persisted, because in rural communities, rituals filled the gaps between death and burial, between doubt and forgiveness. And for those left behind, watching the senator consume the meal brought comfort. They could believe the soul was lighter, safer, even if it meant handing that burden to a living man, who walked away heavier with every meal, a life of accumulated sin. Imagine it. You are a man of 60. You have eaten for the dead 237 times. You remember their names vaguely. The children lost in winter, the mother after childbirth, the farmhand trampled by his own oxen. Each one left a meal on the body, and each one you consumed. Do you feel their sins? Probably not. But you feel their weight, their smell, their eyes, closed beneath your shadow. Villagers whisper about you. Some won't shake your hand. Dogs growl as you pass. You are needed, but never loved. Echoes across cultures. This wasn't just British. Variants of sin eating appear across Eastern Europe, where food was offered to the dead but not eaten. In parts of the Balkans, bread was passed from the dead to the living in symbolic rituals. In China, ancestor offerings of food were common, though not consumed by the family. And in Latin American traditions, food for the dead is still a feature of Day of the Dead altars, though not believed to absorb sin, only honor the spirit. But the British senator was different. He didn't just honor the dead, he swallowed them. Deaths, small economics. A funeral in rural 18th century Wales cost more than most families could spare. The coffin might be home, shroud, a borrowed sheath, of meals served to guests, simple and thin, but the senator was always affordable. One coin, one crust, one drink. And for that, the soul was eased, at least in theory. The long walk home the senator always left alone. He didn't stay for the burial. He didn't eat with the family afterward. He took his bread, his coin, and vanished down the lane. Some lived in cottages apart from the town, others in ruined barns or fringe villages that had no apprentices, no children to inherit the role. It was not a profession, it was a burden accepted until death or until the village. They found someone more desperate. And now, as we look back, we ask, was the senator truly taking on the sins of the dead? Or were the living simply passing on their guilt, their fears, to someone who couldn't afford to refuse? What does it mean to eat in silence, in shame, for people who won't even speak your name? The burden of bread, religion, shame, and the weight of the soul. Let us begin not with death, but with a sermon. A Sunday in Shropshire, 1720, a small stone chapel clings to a hillside like a moss-covered memory. Inside, the rector stands before his congregation, warning against superstition. There shall be no forgiveness, he says, in bread touched by the dead. Sin is not a loaf, nor can it be swallowed by a beggar in rags. The crowd listens politely. They nod. They murmur amen. But on Tuesday, when the tanner's boy falls off the cart and dies with no priest nearby, the family calls the senator anyway, because doctrine is one thing, fear is another. Faith and folklore collide. The senator lived between two worlds on paper. He contradicted everything the Anglican Church and later Methodist teachings asserted about sin, repentance, and salvation. According to Scripture, only God could forgive sins. Only the Church could administer absolution, and only the soul could seek redemption through genuine remorse. But in practice, in the quiet corners of Wales, the borderlands of England, and the glens of Scotland, priests were scarce. The landscape was vast. Belief, like water, flowed wherever it could. Folk rituals stepped in where clergy did not. The role of the communitizing eaters weren't part of the religious elite. They were tools, used reluctantly by grieving families. The community tolerated them but never welcomed them. They were not invited to weddings, rarely greeted in the streets, almost never buried in consecrated ground. Their presence was necessary, but their status was lower than low. Even beggars had neighbors. The senator had only ghosts recorded rituals, though the senator lived on the fringe. The ritual itself was widely acknowledged. A handful of parish records and travelers' accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries describe it in similar terms. Bread or cake placed on the chest of the corpse, ale or milk served in the horn cup, a muttered chant, half prayer, half incantation, a small payment, a farthing or penny, tucked beneath the plate in some areas. A candle was lit and then extinguished after the meal, symbolizing the extinguishing of the soul's burden. In one case from Herefordshire, a senator was required to walk 3 times around the house before entering to confuse the devil and keep the sins from strange, consistent, and quietly feared. What did sin taste like? No records describe the flavor of sin, but we can guess. Stale rye bread, hard cheese, sour ale, all of it soaked slightly from sitting on a cooling corpse. The food was symbolic but not cleaned out, and the act of eating was slow. The senator was expected to take it or no crumbs left behind. There are even accounts where the senator retched afterward, either from disgust or some deeper spiritual nausea. One man in Britain reportedly refused to eat for a woman who had committed suicide. He said her sins were too thick for chewing. No one knows what happened to him after that. Children who watched, many recollections of sin eating come from children, now adults, who watched in silence as the figure arrived. They remember the knock at the door, the long, slow footsteps, the shadow at the table, and the moment he looked up, bread in hand, and said nothing. These impressions lingered into the 19th century. In a letter from 1842, a young woman wrote, "He sat like a shadow, eating the sins of my grandfather. I wished to ask him if he was full from the last man, but my mother slapped my hand and told me never to speak of it again." Senators in literature and lore. As the practice faded, senators became mythologized, not in glory, but in unease. Writers mentioned them in passing, always with an air of decay. A character in a Welsh novel refuses to eat bread after a funeral, calling it touched. A 19th century poem describes a man bent like a crow, black of coat, who dines alone with ghosts. Superstitions emerged that hearing the voice of a senator before dawn meant someone would die before nightfall. In some tales, the senator was cursed and able to die, burdened by too many spirits. In others, he absorbed traits of the dead, a limp from one, a stammer from another. These were folk tales, yes, but they show how deeply the figure lodged in the imagination. What happened to the last ones? By the late 1800s, sin eating was all but gone. Clergy gained better access to rural communities. Literacy improved. Folk beliefs were suppressed by religious reformers and mocked by urban skeptics. The final recorded senators died quietly. Richard Munslow of Rattling Hope died in 1906. His grave reads simply farmer, but he was known to have performed sin-eating rituals late in life, more from tradition than belief. Others, unnamed, were buried in unmarked plots, deliberately kept outside the village line, and with them, the ritual died. No one was taught to replace them. No apprentice was ever chosen. No child said, "When I grow up, I'll eat for the dead." But what remains of their legacy is sin-eating just a relic of rural fear? Or does it reveal something deeper about Usab or our need to transfer guilt, to outsource forgiveness, to create roles for the dirty work of the soul? Who carries the weight when the priest cannot arrive? And who eats alone at the edge of the village, long after the funeral ends? The soul left behind, legacy, psychology, and the last burden. Let's return to the village. The senator has come and gone. The family has buried their loved one. Life resumes quietly with whispered prayers and cautious hope that the soul has moved on in peace. But somewhere, beyond the last fence post, a man sits alone, picking at crumbs, still clinging to his sleeve. No one asks how he feels. No one checks his health. No one truly wants to know, because in the minds of the village, he is full of ghosts. The psychology of guilt transfer today. Scholars of anthropology and psychology look at sin-eating through a new lens, not just as a superstition, but as a profound human mechanism for coping with death. The ritual served multiple purposes. It gave mourners a sense of closure, especially when last rites were unavailable. It offered a physical act of transfer, allowing grief and fear to be symbolically removed. And crucially, it created a scapegoat, someone to absorb communal guilt, fear, and spiritual uncertainty. We now recognize this as a form of ritualized projection. In the absence of explanation, societies invent intermediaries. In modern terms, we might call it emotional outsourcing. The senator is social filter, but there's another side to this. The senator didn't just carry spiritual burden. He became a moral sponge. Villagers could behave however they pleased, knowing that someone else would deal with the afterlife. The act of hiring a senator became a loophole, a spiritual backdoor. He didn't confess, he was cruel in life, but we hired the senator, so he's probably fine. This raises uncomfortable questions. Did senators enable moral laziness? Were they a comfort or a crutch? And what did it do to a man to spend his life carrying the sins of others, while his own went ignored? Because make no mistake, senators were not saints. They were human, flawed, bitter, lonely, and often full of more guilt and memory than anyone else in town. A profession of loneliness. Few historical roles were so consistently marked by isolation. The executioner perhaps, the gravedigger, the leper caretaker, but the senator was worse in one sense. He was paid to carry what could not be seen. He could not confess it, could not return it, and could not share it. He was alone with invisible burdens, and in that way he becomes something profoundly Madonna, symbol of the quiet caretaker, the unseen janitor of emotional messes, the one we ask to do the work, so we don't have to look at the cost. Echoes in modern times. You won't find senators today, not by name at least, but the idea remains. In therapists who absorb the pain of others, in social workers who handle grief that is not their owning, mortuary staff who prepare bodies no one claims, in hospice nurses who listen to final regrets, and sometimes, in the people closest to us, those who silently carry the weight of our mistakes, our failures, our unspoken fears. Modern society doesn't place bread on a body anymore, but it still passes the burden quietly, indirectly, symbolically, and someone always eats it. The last known senator. Let's return, one last time, to Richard Munslow of Rattling Hope, England. He lived a quiet life. Farmer, father, no known criminal record, but late in life, he revived the sin-eating ritual in his village. Not for money, not for tradition, but because he had lost 4 children to illness, and couldn't bear the thought of them crossing alone. He began performing the rite for others, not because he believed in its magic, but because it gave people peace. When he died in 1906, he was buried near the chapel. In 2010, the village raised funds to restore his gravestone. It reads, "The last sin-eater of England, a man of sorrow, a man of peace." Final reflections. What does it mean to carry the weight of others? To be paid in crumbs and drink, then sent into the dust with nothing but someone else's sins in your gut? And what does it mean that, even now, long after the bread has gone stale, we still find new ways to pass the burden? Not in ritual, but in silence, in avoidance, in the quiet hope that someone else will take care of it. Below the streets, life in the filth of the privy pits. The year is 1553, Yorens, Bach. Just across the Thames from the bustling heart of Tudor London, the sun is setting, tavern lights flicker on, and somewhere near the back of the alley, a wooden hatch creaks open. From it emerges a man, soaked to the knees, lantern in hand, carrying a long-handled shovel. He does not speak, he does not meet your eyes. He is a gong farmer, and he smells like the end of the world. What was a gong farmer? To understand the gong farmer, you must first understand the toilet situation in Tudor England. Most homes had privy simple wooden seats over a pit, sometimes dug in a courtyard or at the back of a cellar. These pits could hold months, even years' worth of waste. Once full, they had to be emptied. This is where the gong farmer came in. Gong comes from the Old English gang, meaning to go especially to the toilet. A gong farmer was the person paid to empty privy pits, also known as cesspits, night soil vaults, or filth holes. They worked at night to avoid offending the public. Knows they were not farmers in the modern sense, just handlers of the city's organic waste tools of the trade ed. Gong farmers' equipment was simple and horrifying. Long-handled iron shovels, curved scoop from narrow angles, thick leather aprons, waterproofed with wax or fat knee-high boots. When they had them, rope harnesses to be lowered into deep cesspits buckets for transporting waste to carts or boats. A lantern, though some worked by touch along the average cesspit was 6 to 10 feet deep. In wealthier homes, they could be vaulted beneath stone, requiring crawling through tunnels or lifting floorboards. Some were so toxic that fumes alone could kill a man, and yet the job paid well. The pay in Tudor England. A gong farmer could earn 6 pence a day or more, far above a day laborer's wage. Some earned enough to buy property. Why? Because no one else would do it. The job was dangerous, physically punishing, and socially reviled, but for a man with no land, no name, and a strong stomach, it was a rare path to mobility. The smell. There are no surviving testimonies from gong farmers, but many neighbors wrote about them. Diaries, court records, and city complaints describe a smell that clings to the skin. Rotten eggs made warm by heat, a stench that drove dogs from the alley even after bathing, which was rare. The smell lingered. Their homes were kept apart. Their children often denied apprenticeships in other trades. Some believed the smell carried spiritual taint, that to handle waste was to stain the soul, but still, someone had to do it. What they found in the pits of spits were not just toilets. They were time capsules dark in their depths. Gong farmers found buttons, pins, and dropped coins, bones and food scraps, child's toys, teeth, illegal pamphlets, aborted feet, pets, broken tools, and once, according to a 1578 record, the partial remains of a missing man. Some cesspits were used to hide evidence, store illicit goods, or dispose of things better forgotten. For this reason, some gong farmers were called to testify in criminal trials. Others kept silent and earned extra coin for their silence. Health hazards. Gong farmers faced countless dangers: asphyxiation from methane and ammonia, drowning if the pit caved in, infection from open sores, and wrath. The management of human waste. Cesspits, privies, and the hidden infrastructure of filth. Let us begin not with a person but with a hole in the ground, a cesspit dug behind a butcher's shop. 6 feet deep, 3 feet wide, lined with stone, perhaps if the owner had the coin, otherwise just earth. This pit will collect everything, not just what the human body produces, but what the household throws out. Meat scraps, assists, boiled vegetables, broken ceramics, the occasional unlucky rat. It sits quietly, out of sight, until one day, weeks or months later, it becomes noticeable. The smell drifts through floorboards, flies gather in corners, and the family knows it's time to hire the gong farmer. How did Tudor waste systems work? In short, they barely did. Cities like London, Norwich, and York had no central sewage system in the 1500s. There were no underground sewers in the modern sense. Instead, waste was managed through a combination of privy pits, individual or shared cesspools, communal vaults or tanks, night soil cart, surface drains, often leading to streams or rivers, and most commonly, neglect. Many households simply built over full pits, leaving old ones buried and forgotten beneath floorboards. In poorer areas, chamber pots were emptied into alleyways or gutters. Rain was expected to wash it away, and it rarely did. The trade. Once waste was removed, it had to go somewhere. Gong farmers typically hauled it to rivers, where it was dumped, fields outside the city, where it was sold as fertilizer, or special waste barges moored along the Thames. This cargo was called night soil, and despite its origins, it had value. Farmers paid for it. Gardeners used it. In some cases, entire villages earned coin by accepting city waste as compost. By the late 1500s, a network emerged. Gong farmers collected waste. Middlemen purchased and resold it. Bargemen hauled it to designated dumps or fill. This way, Tudor England had a rudimentary waste economy. The filth of the city fed the fields, and the fields in turn fed the city. Laws and regulations. As cities grew, so did the need for control. London passed multiple laws regulating gong farming. Cesspits had to be sealed to prevent overflown. Soil could not be dumped inside the city walls. Gong farmers had to register with local parishes. Work had to be done only at night to avoid offense to the senses of the gentle class. Fines were common. Enforcement less so. Most neighborhoods turned a blind eye. As long as the waste didn't flood their own cellar, some households bribed gong farmers to dump waste into rivers directly, avoiding taxes. Others dug illegal pits concealed behind false walls or under floorboards. Archaeologists in modern London have discovered dozens of forgotten cesspits beneath Tudor homes still full. Still, toxic waste and disease. The connection between filth and illness wasn't fully understood in Tudor times. Most people believed in miasma theory, that bad smells caused disease. They weren't far off. Cesspits and overflowing gutters were breeding grounds for cholera. Indirectly, plague-on farmers were sometimes blamed for spreading disease, but also quietly thanked when they removed it. In plague years, their work saved lives, though no one praised them for it. They remained as ever, invisible. Gong farmers, and the law despite their role. Gong farmers had very few legal protections. If they were injured on the job, no compensation was offered. If they refused to clean an especially foul pit, they could be fined or worse, replaced by someone hungrier. There are records of apprentices running away. Others died mid-job, and their bodies were pulled up on ropes. One famous case from 1596 records a Gong farmer's tools being stolen, leaving him unable to work. His complaint was dismissed because his profession was considered beneath court attention. He later died in debt. Social mobility. In the Macandiet, a few men rose from the pits. Some Gong farmers saved enough to buy property, usually on the city's edge. A handful opened night soil transport businesses, hiring younger men to do the digging. These were the rare few who used filth to rise. They became known bitterly as dirt lords, still unwelcome at dinner parties, but wealthier than many of their former clients. It was a strange kind of nobility, one built not on land or name, but on what the rest of the world flushed away. So how does a city survive under the weight of its own waste? What does it say about a civilization that hides its filth beneath the floorboards, then looks down on the man who removes it? And what does it feel like to build a life in darkness, knowing that every dawn you rise to a cleaner world, yet no one remembers your name? Below memory, archaeology, legacy, and the afterlife of waste letters begin in a quiet basement in East London, beneath a new cafe, here in Arlington. While preparing to lay electrical cables, workers discovered something strange. A chamber filled to the brim with compacted earth. But it wasn't earth. It was waste preserved for over 400 years inside. Archaeologists found seeds from fruits no longer grown in England, bits of linen cloth, likely torn rags, human hair, carefully trimmed on the remains of 2 small shoes, never reclaimed. This wasn't just garbage, it was history, private lives, compressed by time. All of it cleared, once, by a Gong farmer. The archaeology of waste in modern urban archaeology. Cesspits are gold mines. They offer layers of daily life, food, fashion, medicine, hygiene, birth, death, and almost everyone has the telltale signs of Gong farming. Shovel marks in the stone, abandoned buckets with planks used as temporary bridges, the absence of later buildup, meaning the pit was cleared regularly. These details give us more than written records they ever could, because the poor rarely left diaries, but they left what they ate, what they wore, and what they feared, buried in the pit out back, and someone else had to come clean it up. Death on the job. The mortality rate for Gong farmers was higher than average. Some were crushed when privy vaults collapsed. Others were overcome by damp, a Tudor term for noxious gases. A few simply slipped, drowned, and were forgotten. In one chilling 1613 case, a Gong farmer in York disappeared mid-shift. His body was discovered 2 days later, curled beneath a collapsed plank, one hand still gripping his bucket. The coroner's note read simply, "Death by vapor and waste. No heirs. No statue was erected. No name preserved. But someone else took up the shovel. Because the city needed cleaning." Forgotten names, lasting impact. No known portrait of a Gong farmer exists. No guild record survives. No church mural honors their labor, but their work reshaped the city. Roads remained, clear water remained, somewhat drinkable homes stayed habitable, and they did it all under cover of night, for low pay, and for no recognition. Their only reward, a few coins, a short sleep, and the knowledge that the world above could breathe another day. Modern descendants Gong farmers are long gone, but their descendants work today. We call them sewer technicians, wastewater engineers, septic specialists. Workers, they use tools now. Trucks, masks, training, but the core of the job remains, removing what others leave behind. And much like their Tudor forebears, they're rarely thanked, rarely praised, but utterly, quietly essential. Final reflections. What do we owe to the people who clean our messes? What is dignity when a job makes you unclean in the eyes of society, but keeps the entire world from collapsing? And what does it say about us? That the men who walk through filth to keep others clean are not remembered with marble or bronze, but instead with shovel, marks in stone, under layers of earth, where only archaeologists now pause and whisper, "Someone was here, and they worked." Below memory, archaeology, legacy, and the afterlife of waste letters begin in a quiet basement in East London, beneath a new cafe, here in Arlington. While preparing to lay electrical cables, workers discovered something strange. A chamber filled to the brim with compacted earth, but it wasn't earth, it was waste, preserved for over 400 years. Inside, archaeologists found seeds from fruits no longer grown in England, bits of linen cloth, likely torn rags. Human hair, carefully trimmed, and the remains of 2 small shoes never reclaimed. This wasn't just garbage, that was history. Private lives compressed by time, all of it cleared, once by a gong farmer. The archaeology of waste in modern urban archaeology. Cesspits are gold mines. They offer layers of daily life, food, fashion, medicine, hygiene, birth, death, and almost everyone has the telltale signs of gong farming. Shovel marks in the stone, abandoned buckets, wood planks used as temporary bridges, the absence of later buildup. Meaning the pit was cleared regularly. These details give us more than written records ever could, because the poor rarely left diaries, but they left what they ate, what they wore, and what they feared. Buried in the pit out back, and someone else had to come clean it up. Death on the job. The mortality rate for gong farmers was higher than average. Some were crushed when privy vaults collapsed, the others were overcome by damp, a Tudor term for noxious gases. A few simply slipped, drowned, and were forgotten. In one chilling 1613 case, a gong farmer in York disappeared mid-shift. His body was discovered 2 days later, curled beneath a collapsed plank, one hand still gripping his bucket. The coroner's note read simply, "Death by vapor and waste. No heirs, no statue was erected, no name preserved, but someone else took up the shovel because the city needed cleaning." Forgotten names, lasting impact. No known portrait of a gong farmer exists. No guild record survives. No church mural honors their labor, but their work reshaped the city. Roads remained, clear water remained, somewhat drinkable, homes stayed habitable, and they did it all under cover of night, for low pay, and for no recognition. Their only reward, a few coins, a short sleep, and the knowledge that the world above could breathe another day. Modern descendants gone farmers are long gone, but their descendants work today. We call them sewer technicians, wastewater engineers, septic specialists, sanitation. Workers, they use tools now. Trucks, masks, training. But the core of the job remains, removing what others leave behind. And much like their Tudor forebears, they're rarely thanked, rarely praised, but utterly quietly essential. Final reflections. What do we owe to the people who clean our messes? What is dignity when a job makes you unclean in the eyes of society, but keeps the entire world from collapsing? And what does it say about us? That the men who walked through filth to keep others clean are not remembered with marble or bronze, but instead with shovel, marks in stone, under layers of earth, where only archaeologists now pause and whisper, "Someone was here, and they worked. He dead must be moved." Burial carts, watchmen, and the mechanics of mortality. By midsummer of 1665, London was a city transformed. The elite had fled. Churches locked their doors. Prayers were whispered through windows. But still, day by day, deaths mounted. And every morning the bell ringer's path grew longer. He rang his bell, and behind him followed the carts. The plague cart, death's wheelbarrow. Most plague carts were not built for this purpose. They were market carts, hastily convertedly wheeled, open backed, lined with straw, sometimes sprinkled with lime, pulled by a mule or a manthy cart driver. Sometimes the bell ringer himself collected the dead house by house. No ceremony, no prayer. Only a knock, a body, and a note scribbled on scrap. One man recalled watching a cart pass by. He dragged the body by the ankles, like clearing a kitchen rug. "I remember the eyes, still open." The watchman niche infected house was sealed from the outside. A watchman paid by the parish stood vigil day and night. He ensured no one left, no one entered. Deliveries were received. The sick did not wander. Most watchmen were old, poor, or infirm. They worked shifts of 12 to 16 hours. Some brought stools, others just stood. They were not protectors, they were containment. It was not unusual for watchmen to witness an entire family die over several days, one by one, without ever stepping inside. Plague searchers, women of death alongside bell ringers were the searchers, almost always women. They were hired to inspect the dead and determine cause. It was dangerous work, underpaid and reviled. They entered houses. Others feared, took notes, examined bodies. Most had no formal training. They diagnosed by smell, symptom, and experience. Their presence was so feared that some households hid their sick, fearing that a visit from a searcher would lead to a nailed door and death by isolation. The burial grounds as parish cemeteries overflowed. London resorted to plague. Pits dug deep, often 20 to 30 feet, lined with lime, bodies layered in rows, filled quickly, then covered in hastened. No names, no markers. Just pits. The largest in Aldgate and Moorfields held thousands, and the bell ringer's records were the only acknowledgement that those people ever existed. He rang his bell. He passed the names to the clerk, and they were carted away. A day in the life. Picture it. You are a bell ringer. You rise before dawn. You drink anything to dull the nerves. You collect your bell, your list, your oil-soaked scarf, your route today. Rookery Alley, 3 deaths. St. Dunstan's Lane, 1 suspected, not confirmed. South Bank, 8 dead, including children. The streets are quiet. Each home you approach bears the red cross. Each window is shut. Sometimes a hand reaches out to hand you a note, or a coin, or nothing at all. You write, you ring, you walk. the sound of denial despite the chaos. There were those who refused to believe the bell's meaning. Some refused to report deaths. Others bribed watchmen to look the other way, and still, the bell rang. A diarist from 1665 wrote, "The bell sounded by my street 4 times in a week. I chose not to open my shutters for fear I might see who was taken." Denial did not stop the cart, it only delayed its arrival. The ringing stops as the year turned. Winter slowed the spread. By January 1666, the death toll began to ease. Bell ringers rang less often. Carts rolled with fewer burdens. Searchers returned to lives they barely remembered, but nothing went back to normal. The sound of the bell had rewired the city's nerves. It had carved a path through memory. Some said they still heard it, in alleys, in dreams, in the silence after rainfall. So who are the ones we send to count the dead? Not priests, not doctors, just men with bells, women with ledgers, watchmen with no words. They knock, they listen, they leave, and when the city heals, they disappear. Because no one remembers the ones who kept track. Forgotten sound memory, silence, and the vanishing of the bell. The Great Plague of 1665 left no monuments, no official ceremony, no king's decree of remembrance, and for the bell ringers the end came not with reward or reflection, but simply with a lack of need. The bells stopped ringing. The streets began to stir. Merchants returned. Clergy reopened their chapels. Children played again in alleys that once held bodies, and those who walked the plague routes, the bellmen, the searchers, the cart drivers, quietly vanished. The bell ringers' fate there are no known names of the plague bell ringers of London. Not one. Their deaths, if they came later, were not logged as plague victims. Their lives, if they continued, were spent as laborers, porters, or forgotten drunkards. Some may have died from the exposure, others from grief, most from the world's disinterest. After all, how do you explain to someone that for 3 months, you walked through a city where every door you knocked on held death? There are no medals for that. No sainthood, no pension. Only silence. When the bell stopped, silence returned in stages. First the carts stopped coming daily, then the bell rang only on Sundays. Eventually, not at all. But the memory of that metal note slicing the ailing guard. People dreamed of it, mistook it for wind, jumped at the sound of iron on stone. A chronicler in 1666 wrote, "Though I hear no bells, I believe I always shall." And when the Great Fire swept through London later that year, many said it was a mercy. The old streets were gone, and with them, the places where the bell had echoed most. Cultural amnesia for centuries. The bell ringer was a ghost in the footnotes of history. Victorian historians skipped over them. Even plague art rarely depicts them. They were too ordinary, too unpleasant, too tied to the stench of failure. London remembered the plague as a moral trial, a test of divine will. But the bell ringers reminded the city that it was something else, entirely. A slow, brutal, logistical emergency managed by the poor, for the poor, while the rich ran away. That was not a memory worth celebrating, so the bell was not honored, it was buried. The echo today, yet even now, echoes remain. In pandemic, contact traces, in morgue workers logging the unclaimed din, those who deliver the news that no one wants to give. They may not carry bells, but they walk alone, uncelebrated through the middle of crisis. Their words are short, their shifts long, their grief inherited and unspoken. And still, they ring something, perhaps not in metal but in presence. Final reflections. What do we owe the ones who bore witness? Not the doctors, not the heroes, but the men who rang the bell, the women who counted the dead, the watchers who stood by doors until the last cough faded. What does it do to a person to be that close to loss and still be forgotten? And what will the world sound like when the bell rings again? Wading into the mire, the lives of England's forgotten blood harvesters. Let us begin in Suffolk, around the year 1417. The sun is still low no higher than the top of the distant oak. Mist hangs over the shallow water of a peat marsh. A woman steps forward into the SHALLOWS. She wears a heavy linen shift, already damp. Her apron is tied high and stained dark at the hem. Her boots, none. She needs skin for this job, and as she wades into the water, still and deliberate, the leeches come. The professional leech collecting was one of the most grimly practical professions in medieval Europe. It was not recognized by guilds. It had no charter, no formal apprenticeship, but it was essential. Doctors across England, especially between the 12th and 17th centuries, believed that almost any ailment could be treated by removing blood. Too hot, bleed. Too cold, bleed. Bleed pregnant with twins and seeing demons. Bleed obviously. To do that they needed leeches, and to get leeches, someone had to stand in swamps and marshes for hours at a time, letting the creatures feed on them, until they could be plucked and bottled. That was the leech collector. The worker collector's job was not just uncomfortable, it was painful and dangerous. Here's how it worked. You entered a still or slow-moving body of fresh water, shallow and warm. You stood very stilly, waited. The leeches sensed warmth and approached you, let them attach to your legs, ankles, sometimes hands. Once partially fed, you plucked them off carefully using the edge of a bone or dull knife. You placed them in a ceramic jar, filled with marsh water or moss. For hours, some collectors used cattle instead, letting leeches feed on their legs and collecting them afterward. But the poor, especially women and children, were the most common human bait. Who were the leech collectors? Most leech collectors were women and children, especially young girls, the rural poor widows or orphans without land access outcast groups, including some Roma communities. The job required no land, no tools, and very little oversight, but just a willingness to be bitten and to bleed. And while the work was unregulated, demand was high. Especially during epidemics or plague years, physicians ordered leeches in bulk. A skilled collector could harvest dozens in a day, but the cost, chronic infections, scarring, and in some cases severe anemia or blood loss. The leeches themselves, the species most sought after was Hirudo medicinalis, the European medicinal leech. They could grow up to 20 centimeters long and feed for up to an hour. They had 3 jaws, around 300 teeth, and anticoagulant in their saliva called hirudin, which prevented clotting once full. They dropped off naturally, but collectors couldn't wait that long. Removing them too early caused the leeches to vomit into the wound, sometimes introducing bacteria or parasites. Collectors learned to balance risk and yield. You didn't want to pass out, but you couldn't afford to go home with too few leeches either. The pain and risks. Leech bites weren't deep, but they bled for hours, and in marsh environments where hygiene was impossible, wounds became infected easily. Collectors reported swollen limbs, constant bleeding, leech fever, likely a mix of infection and anemia, numbness in extremities from cold water exposure, wounds that never healed fully. Reopening with each shift, many suffered from permanent scarring, known in some rural regions as leech lace, a dark web of healed puncture, marks across the lower legs. But they kept coming back, because coin was coin, and medicine needed feeding. A collector's morning: imagine waking before dawn. You haven't eaten. There's stale bread, but no fire for soup. You pack your clay jars in a basket lined with straw. The marsh lies just beyond the tree line, still misty. You take off your boots, you roll up your skirt, and you step into the water, already knowing what it will feel like. Not fear, exactly, just resignation, and the faint sting of the first bite. You don't swat it away. That's your money. You close your eyes and wait. So what drives a person to stand in cold water, bleeding slowly for hours, day after day? What is survival worth when the price is your own blood? And in the end, do you even feel the leeches anymore, or just the weight of the jar in your hand? The business of bleeding, medicine, belief, and the marketplace of blood. After a long morning in the marsh, the leech collector returns home. Her legs are wrapped in cloth. Her jaws are sloshing with dark water and writhing forms. She hasn't eaten, but first, she must sell, because in towns and cities across Europe, behind oak doors and beneath vaulted ceilings, there are surgeons and barber physicians preparing for another day of therapeutic bloodletting, and they are waiting on her. A medicine of balance. In medieval Europe, health was understood through the theory of humors. The body, it was believed, contained 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black. Vileness was the result of imbalance. Too much blood, you might be feverish, impulsive, or flushed. Too little, cold, pale, melancholic. The solution: remove some blood. And while a blade was the most direct method, leeches offered something more refined. They were seen as precise, gentler, and far less likely to cause fainting, death, or lawsuits. How leeches were used in the hands of a physician. The leech became a surgical tool. Here's how a typical treatment worked. The leeches were kept in a leech jar, a glazed ceramic pot with holes. In the lid, the physician selected several healthy specimens, rinsed them in clean water. The patient sat or lay still, exposing the area to be treated: forehead, arm, neck, groin. The leech was placed on the skin, usually after a small scratch, to draw blood. It attached and fed for 20 to 60 minutes, swelling up to 5 times its size once full. It dropped off 4, was removed with salt or vinegar afterward. The bite bled for hours, a feature, not a flaw. In the treatment, it was believed the body needed to purge itself. Conditions: treated with leches according to medical manuals of the time. Leches were prescribed for headaches, nosebleeds, fevers, gout, swelling, pregnancy complications, excess of passion, madness, sigh infections, and more. They were even used on children, sometimes infants, to treat teething fevers. In wealthier homes, leeches were applied preventively every spring, a kind of bodily reset, a purging of last year's sins and blood. The trade grows as demand for leeches soared. So too did the trade networks that supported them. Leech collectors sold too. Traveling apothecaries, physicians in market towns, monasteries, or by hospitals, who also performed tooth removals and minor surgeries. By the 1600s, leeches were packaged in barrels, shipped from rural marshes to cities like London, Paris, and Florence. Prices varied by quality and freshness. Collectors learned to keep leeches alive for weeks with moss, cool water, and no feeding. Some dishonest sellers even weighed leeches down with pebbles to make them seem full and fat. It was a small but intricate economy based entirely on blood. The collector's reward despite the demand. Collectors earned very little. A dozen leeches might fetch a single silver coin. More often, collectors were paid in food, cloth, or small domestic goods. Some bartered directly with town doctors. Others walked mile after mile, selling door to door. There was no union, no protection, no promise of a better life, only the knowledge that the jars would empty and the marsh would still be there tomorrow. Blood and belief leeches weren't just tools, they were symbols, too many. Their silent, slow feeding mirrored the quiet drain of sin from the body. Monastic texts sometimes compared them to God's judgment, inevitable cleansing, painful. Poets wrote of love as a leech upon the heart. Scholars warned of leeches as metaphors for greed, gluttony, lust, and yet, when sickness came, even the pious welcomed their bite. There was no shame in needing the leech, only in being the one who caught it. Decline begins, but not yet though. We now know leech therapy was mostly ineffective and often harmful. The practice persisted for centuries. It would not be until the 19th century, with the rise of germ theory and scientific medicine, that leeching would fall from mainstream use. But in the medieval period, the leech was certainty. When nothing else worked, the doctor would reach for the jar, and the leech collector, barefoot and scarred, would be there to refill it. So what does it mean to treat illness by bleeding the patient? To drain the body in hopes that balance will return. And what does it say about medicine, when its most trusted tool is a silent, sightless worm that feeds in the dark? The last jar, decline, disappearance, and the residue of old remedies. It is the late 1800s, in the quiet edges of Norfolk. A boy watches his grandmother wade barefoot into the marsh. She's old now, too old for this work. But the doctor in town still wants 6 leeches a week, and the pharmacist on Church Street keeps a single jar by the window. More curiosity than cure. The boy watches as she stands still, arms folded, waiting for the water to ripple. Once it does, she leans down, gathers them, gently places them in her tin. There's no rush, no urgency, no future in it. The age of leeches is ending. The fall of the leech by the mid-1800s. Medical science was rapidly changing. Germ theory was taking hold. Microscopes showed pathogens, actual visible causes of disease. New drugs like quinine, chloroform, and later aspirin shifted attention away from bodily fluids, and with this change, the humoral model of medicine and its obsession with bleeding was left behind. Doctors began to see blood not as something to balance, but something to preserve. And suddenly, the leech became a medical embarrassment. Market collapse. The leech trade did not vanish all at once, it crashed. Collectors saw demand plummet. Physicians stopped ordering. Apothecaries cleared out leech jars to make room for powders, pills, and antiseptics. Some collectors tried to pivot, selling moss, hunting frogs, or medicinal plants, staking on laundry or low farm work. But for the older ones, the change came too late. By the 1870s, the word leech collector no longer appeared in official trade registries. The jars dried up, the marsh went still. A brief and strange return. Enough. The 20th century saw a brief revival. In the 1960s and 70s, surgeons rediscovered medicinalist for use in microsurgery, especially in reattaching severed limbs, where controlled bleeding helps restore circulation. Today, a few thousand medical-grade leeches are bred in labs under sterile conditions, but the trade of rural collection, of women in aprons and barefoot boys with clay jars, that world is gone. Not outlawed, not abolished, just quietly absorbed into history's wetlands. The collector's legacy. There are no museums to leech collectors, no plaques beside the swamps. Their names were rarely written down, but they shaped a world where medicine, however misguided, was deeply human. They fed a system built on hope, pain, and repetition. Their wounds made others feel healed, and for a few silver coins they kept walking into the marsh, day after day, even as the rest of the world dried its feet and moved on. Final reflections. In the end, the story of leech collectors is not about parasites or potions. It's about belief, about how a civilization can pour centuries of faith into an idea, the body to balance the soul, then abandon it almost overnight, and about the quiet, anonymous people who stood still in the water, not because they believed, but because they needed to eat. How many ideas have we built on that kind of labor? How many more are still waiting to be remembered? In the backwater, ankle deep, with a jar in hand, the machine that leads nowhere. The invention of the treadwheel. It is 1824, and inside Brixton Prison, London's newest model penitentiary, a strange structure has been installed in the labor yard. It is tall, wooden, circular, like a section of watermill stood upright and stripped of purpose. Iron bars stick out from the sides. Boards are spaced evenly like steps. A dozen prisoners stand shoulder to shoulder on the outer edge, and at the command of the warden, they begin to climb. Step, step, step. The wheel turns slowly, resisting slightly, like it doesn't want to move. It groans, so do they. And so begins another day on the treadwheel. The invention of the penal treadwheel. The penal treadwheel was invented by Sir William Cubitt in 1818. Cubitt, an engineer, believed that idle prisoners should not simply sit in cells. They should labor to reform their morals, correct their habits, and contribute to society. His solution, a large, vertical wheel, powered by human steps. Think of it as a cross between a stairmaster and a hamster wheel, except made of oak, powered by misery, and used as punishment. Some wheels powered mills or pumps, but most were what Cubitt called disciplinary wheels, mechanical futility that wore down the body. Not for progress, but for penance. The structure, a standard prison treadwheel, featured a drum, 20 to 30 feet wide planks, spaced like stairs handrails, or iron bars for balance, a shaft connected to either grinding gears, or nothing at all. It rotated slowly, about 2.5 revolutions per minute. Each prisoner climbed continuously for 15 minutes, followed by 5 minutes rest, in rotation. 8 hours per day, 6 days per week. By the end of a single shift, a prisoner would have climbed 10,000 vertical feet. That's roughly the height of Mount Everest, over the course of 5 days. The purpose, punishment over productivity, though Cubitt originally imagined the wheel could be used for powering grain mills or drawing water. In reality, most prisons used it as pure punishment. It was silent, monotonous, and exhausting. It served no productive end. And that was the point. The treadwheel was meant to break pride, crush restlessness, prevent idle hands, impose structure and fatigue, and, most of all, it was meant to remind the inmate, every day, that they were no longer a person with direction. They were part of a wheel now. Who walked the wheel? Treadwheels were used across the British Empire from the 1820s through the early 1900s. Those sentenced to the wheel included petty thieves, vagrants, pickpockets, debtors, political prisoners, sometimes even juveniles. Women too were assigned to separate. Treadwheels smaller, but just as punishing. Most served sentences of weeks to months, though some walked the wheel for over a year. What they shared in common: no voice, no reprieve, no escape but time. The sounds of the day prisons with treadwheels echoed differently. Gone was the rowdy noise of crowded cells. Instead, the steady thump of feet on planks, the creak of oak joints, the occasional barked command, and the low panting of tired lungs. Prisoners were forbidden to speak while on the wheel. They could not look at each other. They could not rest without permission. Those who faltered faced solitary confinement or extra shifts. And all the while, the wheel turned on. A prisoner's shift, a typical day, might look like this. 6 o'clock a.m. wake up and basic meal porridge. Water. 7 a.m. report 2 wheel yard. 7:15 a.m. begin treadwheel duty. Rotates. 15 minutes walking. 5 minutes resting midday. 30-minute break for bread and gruel. Resume walking until 5 o'clock p.m. Evening silence. Lock in. Sleep. No books. No letters. No interaction. Just the endless climb of the wheel. With no view and no forward motion. The psychological toll. It was not the exhaustion that broke most inmates. It was the pointlessness. You moved, you sweated, you ate, and you got nowhere. Prisoners described hallucinations, numbness in legs and hands, blisters that split open, nightmares of endless steps, silence so heavy it rang in their ears, and when you were finally released, you never forgot the feeling of stepping endlessly without ever arriving. So what kind of justice walks in circles? What kind of punishment prefers futility over correction? And what happens to a man when the only thing asked of him each day is to move in place toward nothing? Turning justice, reform, resistance, and the psychology of the wheel. Let us return to Brixton Prison. 1835. It's summer hot. The yard smells of sweat and timber and iron inside the wheelhouse. 20 men climb in rotating shifts. An overseer paces behind them, boots echoing, ready to strike his cane if any foot falters. Above the door hangs a wooden sign. Black letters carved: deep labor and silence, repent and stillness. But no one here is repenting, they are enduring. Wheel as moral engine. In Victorian England, punishment was no longer about torture, it was about discipline, and the treadwheel fit the new ideology perfectly. To reform a criminal, society believed he must be stripped of vice, deprived of leisure, placed in a routine so dull and exacting it would reshape his soul. In this context, the wheel became a kind of moral grindstone. It wore away idleness. It forced order onto chaos. And because it involved no whips, no branding, no hangings, it was considered humane. But humane does not mean harmless. Resistance and collapse. Not every prisoner submitted quietly. Some faked injuries. Others whispered rebellions during rest breaks. A few tried to leap off mid-step, risking broken legs for a moment of control. In 1842, an outbreak of foot infections at York Castle was traced directly to open blisters left untreated on the treadwheel. At Colbat, Fields reports surfaced of a man who refused to move. He was chained in place, left to hang limp over the wheel for hours. These reports filtered to journalists, reformers, and slowly the public began to question, what was this machine, really? Justice or cruelty in disguise? The psychology of futility. Who observed treadwheel prisoners began to notice symptoms beyond the physical. Blank expressions, difficulty concentrating, chronic fatigue, anxiety around enclosed spaces, speech patterns, night terrors involving stairs or endless halls. These weren't just tired men, they were mentally unraveling. And still, the wheel turned, because the public, safe and removed, believed that labor, any labor, must be good for the soul, even if it was slowly breaking the mind. Variations across the empire. Britain exported the treadwheel across its colonies. India used in British-controlled prisons for native convicts. Australia implemented in penal colonies. Alongside hard-labored Caribbean deployed against enslaved people and prisoners, post-emancipation the wheel became a symbol of British penal philosophy. Silent, repetitive, dehumanizing, efficient. It looked modern. It sounded reasonable, but inside it remained medieval punishment without pain, but not without suffering. Reform begins by the 1870s. Reformers like Elizabeth Fry, John Howard, and Alexander McConaughey began advocating for alternatives. They argued that punishment should aim to educate, not destroy. That forced motion without purpose was psychological cruelty. That many inmates left prison worse than they entered. Newspapers published anonymous testimonies. We climbed into our own graves, step by step, and heard no one speak. Petitions were filed, parliamentary debates held, and slowly, the idea of the wheel began to wobble. A shift in public consciousness. One Victorian pamphlet put it plainly: the wheel turns, but toward what? The man beneath it turns also, but only into dust. By the 1880s, many prisons were phasing the treadwheel out. Some dismantled them entirely, others turned them into curiosities for visitors to gawk at. But for the men and women who walked them, there were no medals, no apologies, no official acknowledgments. Just aching knees, blurred dreams, and the lifelong fear of stairs. The silence after when the wheels stopped turning. The silence was almost uncanny. Prison yards, once echoing with creaking oak, fell quiet. Some guards missed the structure. Others admitted they no longer had to monitor suicide attempts quite so closely. And for prisoners, some couldn't sleep at night. The lack of motion was unsettling. They had grown used to the sound of their own forced footsteps, and now there was only stillness. So what does it mean to punish someone with endless movement? To demand labor not for use, but for symbolism. And when a society decides the machine must stop, who is left carrying its rhythm in their bones? Echoes in the stone, the death of the treadwheel and its long shadow. By 1902, the last penal treadwheels in England had been shut down. The machines, once symbols of industrialized punishment, were now rusted skeletons and disused wings of crumbling jails. In Brixton, the original cubit model was dismantled, plank by plank. No ceremony marked its passing. No marker was installed, but the silence it left behind was deep and unsettling. The last prisoner, we don't know his name, but records from Wandsworth Jail show that in 1895, one man completed a full treadwheel sentence of 90 days. His offense, stealing 6 loaves of bread each day. He climbed the equivalent of 3,000 feet. Each night he collapsed on a straw pallet, his ankles blistered, his back stiff. By week 6 he had stopped speaking, the warder wrote. He marches still, even in sleep. After his release he disappeared from the records. Footnote in a forgotten file. A man turned into motion. Wheels after life. Some treadwheels were broken apart for scraps. Sold to farmers as makeshift threshers left to rot in locked wings. Displayed briefly in criminal museums, but their legacy remained not in machinery, but in metaphor. Writers and reformers used the treadwheel to describe the futility of poverty, the monotony of factory work, the soul-crushing rhythm of modern life. The phrase "on the treadmill" entered everyday English. Originally literal, now figurative, still haunting. Memory and architecture. In some older British prisons, you can still find the wheels mark, a widened doorway, once built to roll in its massive drum iron hooks in the ceiling for harness straps. Deep scuffs in the stone floor where wooden steps once ground through. Few visitors notice, but if you walk slow enough and listen close enough, the past hums faintly beneath your feet. Modern echoes today. The idea of meaningless labor as punishment still exists in overlit prison laundries and endless forms filled for a parole board that may never listen and work. Programs that pay pennies per hour for tasks no one values. We no longer use oak and iron, but sometimes the wheel turns anyway, and those trapped on it feel the same weariness, the same silence, the same longing for purpose beyond punishment. The psychology of the machine. Modern psychologists now study the long-term effects of purposeless labor, loss of identity, emotional numbness, chronic fatigue, syndrome, institutional dependence. Shame. One researcher called it slow erasure of selfhood. Treadwheel prisoners didn't just do time, they became part of a mechanism that demanded movement and offered nothing. Even decades later, some former inmates would flinch at the sound of wooden steps or report dreams of walking without destination forever. A quiet reckoning. There has never been a national apology for the treadwheel. No state inquiry, no compensation to those broken by it, no memorial. But in academic halls and quiet books, the conversation continues. Historians ask, how did a civilized society allow this? Why did so few speak out until it was too late? And how many prisons today still punish not with pain, but with emptiness? The wheel is gone, but the questions remain. Final reflections. The treadwheel didn't just punish, it reshaped what punishment meant. Not through brutality, but through banality. A machine that made no noise unless you were close, no progress unless you were outside it, and for those within, it was the slowest form of disappearance ever built. A turning that left no market in the joints, the bones, and the dreams of the men and women who once walked it. Step, 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 and now silence. The man who ate sins, death, belief, and the weight of one final meal. Let us begin in a remote valley in Breconshire, Wales. Sometime in the early 1700s, a cottage sits in shadow. Its hearth, long, cold. Inside, a body lies stretched across a simple table, wrapped in a woolen shroud. Outside, villagers whisper. Some pray, others avert their eyes. Then he arrives, worn boots, mud-stained cloak, eyes that have seen too much and are still not welcome. He says nothing. He does not look at the family. He approaches the corpse and sits. A crust of bread is placed on the chest, a mug of beer beside it. The man eats the bread, drinks the ale. And rises. The sin has been taken. The origins of sin eating. Sin eating was a funerary ritual, primarily practiced in rural Wales, Western England, and parts of Scotland from the 1600s to the early 1800s. The idea was simply it's deeply unsettling when a person died. They were believed to carry unconfessed sins. If not cleansed, these sins would prevent their peaceful passing into the afterlife. But what if a priest wasn't present? Or what if the deceased had died suddenly without time for confession? That's where the senator came in. He, or sometimes she, would consume food and drink laid upon or near the corpse, believed to absorb the sins of the dead into their own body. It was spiritual sanitation. One man damned, so another might be saved. The ritual, though details varied by region, the core of the ritual remained consistent. A small loaf of bread or oatcake was placed on the breast or face of the deceased. Teacup or horn of ale was left beside it. The senator arrived often at dusk. Always alone, he sat beside the corpse in silence. He consumed the offerings, slowly, without prayer. Sometimes a short phrase was uttered. I give easement and rest now to thee, dear man. Come not down the lanes or in our meadows. Rest in thy peace. He was paid a small coin, rarely more than a few pence. Then he left. Never touching the mourners or lingering. The meal was symbolic, but to those present, the act was real. The sins were taken. Who were the senators? Senators were always marginal figures that destitute, the elderly, wandering, poor, physically marked by illness or disfigurement, or fan considered half pagan, even demonic. And yet they were necessary, because death came to every village, and not every soul died clean. To touch the sins of another was to become ritually polluted. Sin eaters were never allowed to marry, never buried in consecrated ground, and rarely spoken of in life. Children were told to fear them, adults to pity them, but when death came, they were summoned all the same. Why the church feared them? The church viewed sin eating as heretical. Salvation, according to Christian doctrine, came through confession, absolution, and the grace of God, not bread and fire on a corpse's chest. Yet sin eating persisted, especially in remote rural communities. Why? Because for the poor, death rituals were often improvised, and when the priest didn't come or wouldn't, villagers turned to what they knew. The church tried to stamp the practice out, but its persistence reveals something deeper. A folk theology older than Rome, woven with fear, love, and the need to do something when the body stopped breathing. A meal of sorrow. Imagine being a senator. You are summoned to a stranger's home. You sit beside the cooling flesh of a man or woman you've never known. You eat dry bread in silence while their family looks at the floor. No one says your name. No one thanks you. You walk away with the copper coin still warm in your pocket, and another soul's weight in your belly. And tomorrow, they'll cross the street to avoid you, but they'll call again when the next death comes. So who carries the weight of the dead when the living no longer can? And what does it mean to consume sin? Is it superstition, mercy, or simply the oldest kind of contract? A meal in exchange for peace. The weight of the meal, isolation, lore, and the price of mercy. To understand the senator, we must look beyond the ritual, beyond the dim cottages and funerals. We must walk with him through the days between, the days where no one dies, but everyone remembers. A life apart. The Needers lived on the edge of society, physically and spiritually. They were landless at church and beggars or drifters sleeping in barns, sheds, or alone in the woods. Many were former shepherds, failed tradesmen, or widowed women without family. They ate when they were paid. They were paid only when someone died. This was not a calling. It was survival, and yet each time they ate, their invisibility grew. The more souls they consumed, the less human they became in the eyes of their neighbors. The folklore around them built a spiritual stench only animals could smell. Were haunted by the dead they had fed upon. Could never look a priest in the eye. Were cursed to walk alone in the afterlife. Heavy with unconfessed sin. In some tales, the senator exploded at death, releasing a black mist of all the sins he had stored. Others said that if you buried a senator in church ground, crops would wither and wells would sour. It didn't matter that these were stories, they were believed, and belief shaped behavior. Even when he saved a soul, the senator lost a piece of his own. Children's warnings. Children were warned, don't stare at the senator, don't speak his name after dark, don't ever eat from the same bowl. If a child accidentally touched one, they were brought to the priest for immediate blessing. Some were made to bathe in cold streams. Even the animals acted strangely around senators, it was said. Dogs would not bark at them. Cats fled. Crows followed them from tree to tree. Whether any of this was true didn't matter. The man in the tattered cloak was now part man, part myth. Moments of kindness and Yet there were moments: a loaf of warm bread left on a stone, a child too young to fear, offering a flower, a widow who could not afford coin but pressed an apple into his palm anyway, even in rejection. There were flashes of quiet gratitude, because every village knew no matter what they said, they might need him again, and in that strange transaction, there was a kind of tragic respect, the senator's own death. One of the cruelest ironies of senating was this: no one would eat for the senator when he died. His body was often buried in unconsecrated ground, left without funeral rites, denied a proper coffin, or sometimes burned in secret. Villagers feared that his sins, the hundreds he had taken, might escape. They believed his soul had no place to go. He had become a vessel too full to rise, and so, even in death, the senator remained alone. Historical mentions, though, little formal documentation survives. A few historical references linger. A 17th century Welsh cleric wrote of a man who was paid in ale to consume the misdeeds of the carpenter. An English traveller in the 1680s recorded a funeral in Herefordshire where a lean man ate coarse bread upon the corpse. And in 1842, the practice was declared pagan and extinct by Anglican authorities, though rural rumors persisted. For decades, the last known senator by name was Richard Munslow, who died in 1906 in Shropshire. He had served as a senator by choice, not desperation perhaps, out of remorse after the loss of 4 of his children. He is buried in a churchyard. His grave, unusually, is marked and tended, perhaps an acknowledgement that even the devoured deserve peace. Ghosts in the modern minds eaters no longer walk our hills, but the idea remains: someone to carry shames, someone to remove burdens, someone to be cast out, so others can stay clean. You see it in scapegoats and lameshtim, in the unspoken weight placed on the vulnerable. We don't eat bread from corpses anymore, but we still ask others to carry what we cannot bear ourselves. So what becomes of a soul who eats the pain of others? Does he carry it forever, or does he finally, in death, pass it on to the earth? One last burden. Finally put down, the last burden: memory, myth, and the echo of a forgotten role. The village has changed. The cottages are still here, but now they have slates on the roof and windows with glass. The roads are paved. The church has been restored with a tall iron gate. There's even a new bakery on the high street. Fresh loaves. No sins, but if you walk behind the church, into the older part of the graveyard, you'll find a stone lobe, weathered, slightly askew, and beneath it lies the last senator of this place. His name was forgotten, but his work remains. Why did the practice die? The answer is not dramatic. There was no decree, no official ban that it ended, as so many rural customs do, quietly, slowly, with the world moving on, and the need no longer outweighing the discomfort. Several forces contributed: the rise of professional clergy, more accessible to remote areas, improved roads, allowing priests to reach deathbeds, and increased education, which brought stronger religious orthodoxy, and the decline of folk belief, pushed aside by industrial logic and Protestant reform. The senator was not abolished, he was simply no longer invited, but the need remained still. Even as the practice faded, the need it served never quite vanished. Modern psychology would call it guilt management. Sociology would call it ritualized shame displacement. But to the villagers it was something simpler. We could not bury them with scenes. Someone had to take them. Even today, we search for people to carry what we cannot. The therapist, absorbing confession; the nurse, staying by the dying; the anonymous stranger, holding a secret they did not ask for. Will modernize the process, but the emotion, the transaction, it remains very old. The senator as archetype in myth and literature. The senator evolved into a symbol. In Gothic novels, he became the doomed outsider, bearing the rot others denied. In horror films, a literal eater of priest, half demon. In poetry, a tragic figure, too human to be holy, too holy to be welcome. Carl Jung might have called him the shadow, the figure cast out because he contains the parts we refuse to see in ourselves. Every society has a role like this. And every society, eventually, forgets their name. Echoes in the modern world, you still hear traces of sin eating in places like prison chaplains, hearing last confessions. No one else wants death doulas, guiding people through their final fears. War veterans, holding memories others can't look at, even in online spaces, where people anonymously share their worst truths, asking only for someone to witness. They don't want solutions. They want the burden lightened, even briefly. They want, in some form, a senator, a legacy without honor despite their vital role. Senators left almost nothing behind. No writings, no lineage, no preserved rituals beyond fragments and guesses, no canonized names. And yet, the fact that the tradition lasted centuries tells us something important. It worked. Maybe not spiritually, maybe not morally, but it filled a real human need in small communities, the need to believe the dead had found peace, and the living could walk away lighter. Final reflections. The senator reminds us of 2 things. First, that some tasks must be done, even if no one wants to do them. Second, that those who take our burdens often carry more than we ever see. They live at the edges, and when they vanish, they are not missed loudly. But part of us knows they're gone. So the next time you feel a need to whisper something terrible, to pass on a weight you cannot hold, Ask yourself, who eats the sin now? And are we ready to live in a world where no one is left to take it? Beneath the crown, sanitation, stench, and the hidden city, let us walk through Elizabethan London. Sometime in the 1580s. It's early morning. The Thames is misty. The bells from St. Paul's toll softly. A merchant opens the shutters of his riverside home and breathes in the unmistakable scent of rot, sewage, and stagnant refuse. The smell is not just coming from the streets, it's coming from beneath them because London has grown, but its infrastructure has not. The limits of urban growth by the mid-16th century. London was swelling beyond what medieval engineers had ever imagined. The population had doubled in less than 100 years. Thousands of homes had been built without formal drainage. Rain carried chamber pot contents into alleys and lower street cesspits, overflowed into cellars, waste seeped into wells, and groundwater ran still. The solution remained: the gong farmer, because the sewer as we understand it today did not exist. London was held together with wood, clay, and wishful thinking. How waste was managed or not. Cesspits were typically dug under or behind homes. Some had stone linings. Most were just open soil holes, covered with planks. These pits were emptied only when full, which could mean months or years between cleanings. Overflow was common. During heavy rains, waste would flood into courtyards or alleyways. The city attempted to control this with laws. A 1575 statute required households to empty cesspits at least once a year. Night soil had to be dumped outside city walls. Usually after midnight. Gong farmers were licensed by the commissioners of sewers. A real office. Dumping waste into the Thames was technically illegal, though often ignored still. Enforcement was inconsistent, because the problem was larger than any one guild, law, or man with a shovel. Gong farmers and the law to work legally. Gong farmers needed a license, issued by parish or city authority. This allowed them to access private properties at night, transport waste through the streets. Specified dump sites. Lacetals avoid arrest by watchmen or parish constables, however. Even licensed workers were routinely fined for excessive stench or sloppy work, forbidden from entering certain neighborhoods by denied access to many taverns, guild halls, and markets, required to wear distinctive badges or coats. In some districts, one record from Southwark describes a gong farmer being stoned by children for crossing into town too early. Respectable citizens relied on them, but no one wanted to see them. Filth as a class issue. The waste problem wasn't evenly distributed. The poor lived in tightly packed alleys, with overflowing pits. The rich had private privies and paid more for discreet cleaning. Monasteries and guilds had stone channels running waste to riverbank sand when pits overflowed in poor areas. The rich complained about the smell, not the conditions. One letter from a London alderman in 1592 reads, "The stink from Bishop's Court doth invade my window. Have the dung men called at once." The waste was not just physical, it was social, and it reminded everyone of their place. Dumping the waste, where did all that night soil go? Typically, outside the city walls. In open dumping grounds called Lestalsto, the riverbanks, especially the Thames at low tide, to rural farms, where it was used as fertilizer, often without the farmers' consent, into abandoned wells, cisterns, or even grave pits. By 1600, London's lastals were so overwhelmed that illegal dumping became common. Gong farmers were caught pouring waste into ditches, burying it in shallow holes, selling it directly to fields. With no processing, this led to periodic outbreaks of disease, typhus, dysentery, the ever-present fear of plague, and each time, the city responded by blaming the gong farmers. Not the system, not the infrastructure. Just the men at the bottom of the ladder. The smell of the city. It's hard to overstate how much London stank in the 16th century. Visitors wrote of a moist and bitter air. The humours of refuse to freely scattered. A city whose breath doth bite the eyes. Perfumed handkerchiefs were common. So were nose guests, small floral bundles carried under the nose. Doctors believed that miasma or bad air caused illness, so the smell itself was feared as poison. And every night, gong farmers were the source not of the waste, but of its removal. Still, they became symbols of the stench, walking reminders that something under the kingdom was rotting. So who was really to blame? The men who lifted the bucket, or the cities that buried their filth until it spilled back out? And what does it mean when the dirtiest work is also the most invisible? Down the hole, the birth of a profession few survived. It's a damp night in London, circa 1554. The streets are empty save for the clop of hooves, the soft squelch of mud, and the faint, unmistakable stench of something awful. Down a narrow alley, a wooden hatch is lifted. Two men appear, one holding a rusted lantern, the other lowering a rope. Below them, a third man stands in a cesspit waist deep in human excrement. Surrounded by the runoff of hundreds of households, he wears thick boots, a leather apron, and over his face a cloth soaked in vinegar. He is a gong farmer, and it's just past midnight. Time to begin work. What was a gong farmer? The word gong comes from the Old English gang, meaning to go, particularly to the toilet. A gong became slang for excrement, and so a gong farmer was literally one who harvested human waste. These men emptied cesspits beneath homes, in public-private hall, night soil, raw sewage to dumps or farms maintained drainage tunnels in cities and did it all by hand. In the dead of night, out of sight and out of mind. It was hard, it was filthy, and it was deadly, but it paid well because no one else wanted the job. The tools of the trade. A gong farmer's kit was basic but essential. Leather apron to keep waste from soaking in, thick gloves or wrappings rarely replaced, often rotted rope, and bucket system for lifting waste out of pits, lantern or candle secured high to avoid gas explosion spools, and long-handled scoops for stirring and transferring. They often worked in teams of 3. One man in the pit, one hauling from a bucket, carting the waste to a dump site or manure field. They worked by night, by law, because no one wanted to size or smell them by day. The dangers of the job. Gong farmers faced a laundry list of horrors: toxic fumes from methane, ammonia, and sulfur asphyxiation in confined pits with no air circulation, collapse of rotted wooden pit walls, skin infections from constant contact with waste, rat bites, maggot infestations, trench foot, and open sores, blindness from gas exposure or lime. One slip meant drowning in filth. One breath too deep could knock you unconscious, and there were stories, terrible ones, of men found dead in the morning, floating face down, shovel still in hand. No one touched the body until the pit was drained. Even in death, the gong farmer was left to his hole. How were they treated? Poorly. Gong farmers were feared as disease carriers, mocked in plays and sermons, forbidden from entering churches or public, and sometimes paid in food rather than coin, often buried outside consecrated ground. And yet they were essential. No Tudor city could function without them. Their work prevented plagues, kept privies from bursting into cellars, and allowed nobles to host their feasts above a clean floor. They were despised, but needed. A theme we've seen before. A gong farmer's routine. A typical shift looked like this. Begin at midnight, when streets were quiet. Locate and open cesspit hatches behind homes or tap vents. Lower one man into the pit, sometimes 10 feet deep. Scoop and lift bucket after bucket of night soil, loaded onto a car. Transport the waste to designated dunghills or fertilizer fields outside the city. Return before sunrise. Clean tools in river or stream. Sleep during the day alone in designated quarters far from others. By law, they were forbidden to work more than twice a week. Why? Because even in Tudor times, it was considered too dangerous to do daily, and yet they were paid well despite their low status. Gong farmers were among the best paid laborers in Tudor society. Some made the equivalent of a skilled craftsman's wage. Why? Because no one else wanted the job. It was supply and demand in its rawest, most pungent form. There are even records of some gong farmers buying land or retiring early, but they never escaped the smell. Not from their skin, not from their reputation, not from their own minds. So what happens to a man who spends his life waist deep in the waste of others? Can he ever wash off the judgment? Does the gold he earns outweigh the filth he walks in? And what does it say about a society that it hides? The men who keep it clean. Clean hands, dirty work. The disappearance and legacy of the gong farmer. Let us begin in London, 1854. The city is vast now, a steam-powered sprawl of brick and soot, but beneath its cobbled streets, the old cesspits still fester. And then, one summer, it happens, the great stink. The Thames turns black, the air turns sour, and the lawmakers who had ignored the filth for centuries suddenly cannot bear the smell in their own halls. Within weeks a plan is approved. A new thing, massive, unseen, a true sewer system. The gong farmer's time is nearly over. The end of the gong farmer. As the 19th century rolled on, brick-lined sewers replaced cesspits. Indoor plumbing was installed. In new urban housing, water closets flushed waste directly to underground tunnels. Municipal sanitation became a profession. Regulated and funded gong farmers, once essential, were laid off, absorbed into new public health roles, or quietly disappeared. Their title vanished from records. The word gong returned to meaning noise. The man who had lived in the muck, forgotten. Joseph Bazalgette, and the new arrow, the man behind London's sewers. Sir Joseph Bazalgette engineered over 1,000 miles of underground piping after the Great Stink. He is remembered, knighted, praised in textbooks. And yet his success was only possible because of centuries of night laborers who came before him. They mapped the city's waste through scars, sores, and breathless nights. Bazalgette's tunnels were brilliant, but they were built on the backs of men who had no names left. Sanitation becomes science with the arrival of germ theory and the rise of modern hygiene in the 19th century. Waste became a public health issue, not just a nuisance. Sanitation engineers replaced gong farmers. Municipal workers wore uniforms and received training. Cesspits were condemned. Pipes were standard. People stopped thinking about where their waste went, because it was now invisible. Clean, out of sight, someone else's job. The gong farmer was gone, but the division remained. Those who flushed and those who cleaned. Who cleans for the cleaners? Even today, the legacy of the gong farmer lives on, in silent, invisible roles. Sewer maintenance workers, septic tank technicians, sanitation crews working the night shift, wastewater treatment plant operators, rarely thanked, rarely seen. They are descendants, not in blood, but in burden, and they face many of the same realities. Health risks, social distance disregard because modern society still prefers not to look at the whole, just as long as it stays covered. Memory and misremembering when we remember Tudor England. We speak of Elizabeth's court, Shakespeare's plays, exploration, plague, and parchment, but we forget the men who stood in pits, who stopped the city from drowning in its own waste, who lived on vinegar, silence, and 2 shifts a week. Even the worst jobs deserve memory, because without them, nothing grand would stand for long. Final reflections. The story of the gong farmer is not just about sewage, it's about what a society chooses to see, and what it chooses to hide. We glorify kings, poets, generals, but for every throne polished, there was a man scrubbing what ran beneath it. And so, perhaps we should look again at the alleys, the basements, the utility tunnels of today. Someone is still there with gloves, with boots, with a job no one thanks them for, because civilization is built on clean floors, and someone always cleans them, wading in blood. Who gathered the leeches and why they bled. The sick, it begins with a prescription. A patient is pale, feverish, out of balance. The village barber surgeon frowns. He sniffs, he pokes. Then with confidence he declares too much blood. A common diagnosis. The cure. Leeches. Dozens if possible. But where do they come from? Certainly not a tidy box, not a sterile jar. No, leeches must be caught by hand, one by one. And that task fell to leech collectors. Who were the leech collectors? Leech collecting was a job largely performed by poor rural women, especially in England, Ireland, and the Low Countries. Often widows, unmarried girls, or the very elderly, typically working alone or with a single child as helper, paid by the dozen. Not the day. They were not hired by apothecaries directly. Instead, they were part of a grey network of informal labor, selling to traveling herb sellers or barber surgeons in nearby towns. For many, it was not a profession. It was survival. The tools of the trade. What did a leech collector carry? A bucket, or a wooden container, lined with damp moss or cloth. A long stick, used to stir the water occasionally. A small net, though many simply used bare hands, blade or sharp stone, not for the leeches, but to open their own skin, should bait be neat. Notably, they wore no protective gear, no gloves, no boots. Leeches were best attracted to bare skin, warm, living, bleeding. The more bites, the better. And so, the collector became the bait. The work itself. The best time to collect was early morning or twilight, when water was cool and leeches were active. Collectors would wade into ponds, marshes, or flooded meadows, stand motionless, often for hours, wait for leeches to attach 2 legs, feet, arms. Remove them gently. To avoid bursting or harming them, place them into the moss-lined bucket. Keep them cool, moist, and alive until sold. It was slow, repetitive work, and extremely painful. The bite and its risk. Leeches secrete an anticoagulant that bite. This means the bite bleeds continuously, sometimes for hours. Most collectors suffered blood loss, dizziness, skin infections, ulcers from repeated bites, secondary illnesses from standing in cold, bacteria-rich water. In some cases, collectors fainted, only to wake soaked in blood. More than one drowned in shallow ponds after collapsing from fatigue or fever. But they returned the next day because leeches were in demand. Why were leeches so valuable? Medieval and early modern medicine followed the humoral theory. The body contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Illness, it was believed, came from imbalance. Too much blood. Bleed the patient. Leeches were considered cleaner than cutting, less painful than a lancet, though not painless, ideal for hard-to-reach areas. Like the gums or eyelids, reusable if fed sparingly and purged. A single doctor might use dozens per day. Hospitals kept leech jars, the way pharmacies now stock pills. Collectors who could supply them were vital, even if they were never thanked. A collector's day. Imagine it. A woman, 70 years old, barefoot in the fog. Her skirt is pinned up. Her hands shake, but she knows this pond well. She's been here every morning since her husband died. Each leech she collects is a halfpenny, maybe enough for bread. She lets the creatures latch on. She waits, bite, sting, blood runs, and when her bucket is full, she limps back home. Not healed, not well, but able, for another day, to stay alive. So who truly gave their blood in this system? The patient, lying comfortably in bed, or the woman, shivering in the mire, trading her own health for theirs? And what does it mean when we take healing from someone else's pain? The service of blood, medieval medicine, belief, and the life of the leeches. Let us step inside a small English infirmary. Sometime around the year 1478, a young man lies on a wooden table, sweating through his linen shift. The barber surgeon, brow furrowed, hums to himself. Then, with practiced fingers, he opens a ceramic jar. Inside, 6 dark, writhing creatures, each one hungry and twitching in the cool air. No anesthesia, no antiseptic. The leeches are placed on the boy's arms, temples, and chest, and now they are dead. Wait, because medicine, in this moment, is not about curing, it's about releasing. Why leeches? The use of leeches. Herodotherapy is older than most religions. Records show it in ancient Egypt, 1500 BCE. Leeches used to balance spirits. India in Ayurvedic texts as a blood purifier. Greece. Hippocrates referenced their use indirectly through bloodletting. Rome. Galen formalized humoral theory, which would guide European medicine for over 1,000 years. By the Middle Ages, the idea of blood as the body's fire had taken root. Too much blood, you burned. Fever, anger, inflammation. Too little, you froze. Fatigue, melancholy. The solution: adjust the fire, let it out. And what better way than a living tool? The market for leeches. By the 13th century, leeches were sold in market stalls, beside herbs and spices, in apothecary shops, kept in glass jars with moss by traveling traders who bought from rural collectors and sold to cities. The demand was enormous. Nobles used leeches for routine maintenance, seasonal bloodletting. To maintain balance, monasteries used them in infirmaries, often recording exact weights of blood loss. Physicians recommended leeches for everything from nosebleeds to childbirth. In France, records show that royal physicians used over 1,000 leeches per year. In Ireland, leeches were included in marriage. Dowries, a valuable resource for a household. The leech was not just a creature, it was currency. The collector's economic place. Despite the high demand, the leech collector remained poor. Collectors were typically paid per dozen, usually 1 or 2 farthings each, in trade bread, cloth, or soup instead of coins occasionally. With leeches taken in partial payment and resold, the income was inconsistent. In dry years when marshes shrank, leech shortages caused prices to spike. Some collectors were mugged for their buckets. Others were accused of stealing from apothecaries or selling diseased specimens. It was a fragile profession, and yet when a collector died, someone else took her place because the work always came back. As long as people bled, leeches were needed. Medical practice. How leeches were applied. Once delivered to a doctor, leeches were rinsed in clean spring water, starved for several days. To make them more eager, sometimes tested by placing them on goat's blood to see their reaction. Placed on warm parts of the body where veins were visible, the leech would attach with its sucker-like mouth, release anesthetic saliva, so the patient felt little pain. Secrete anticoagulants, allowing blood to flow continuously. Detach after 20 to 60 minutes. Once full, some grew 3 times their size after feeding. Doctors saved them, bled them, and used them again. Patients were told to rest. Their imbalance had been temporarily restored. The strange case of overbleeding, but the system was flawed. Without understanding germs, platelets, or blood pressure, physicians often overbled patients. There are records of women fainting after postpartum leech, children weakened by routine seasonal bloodletting, elderly patients dying from excessive leech use. In one infamous case, in the 19th century, much later, George Washington was bled of over 40% of his blood after developing a sore throat. He died, not from the illness, but from the cure. Yet the belief endured. Leeches remained respectable medicine for centuries. Collectors fed that system silently. Bloodied, barefoot, superstition and symbolism beyond medicine. Leeches held symbolic weight. In folktales, they were feared as demons or spirits of sickness. Some believed leeches could absorb sign through blood. Others used dried leeches in amulets, believing they could ward off fever. In Slavic traditions, leeches were buried after use to prevent the spread of pain they had drawn out. Collectors, too, were viewed with suspicion. Some villagers believed they had water magic, could speak to pond spirits, were marked by the devil, especially if they never got bitten. So once again, the woman who served health was kept apart, seen but never touched. So what does it mean when healing is done by those society avoids? When bloodletting becomes both cure and punishment? And when pain quiet, repeated pain becomes the price of every remedy? From cure to curio, the fall of the leech and the ghost left behind. It is the year 1883, and a British physician holds up a glass vial. Inside, a single leech floats, half-starved, sluggish. He frowns, sets it aside, and for the first time in centuries, a patient is treated with quinine, not bleeding because something has shifted the microscope. The germ, the rise of modern medicine. The leech is dying out, not biologically. Culturally, the collapse of humoral medicine by the late 18th and 19th centuries. New tools, microscopes, clinical thermometers, blood pressure cuffs allowed doctors to measure the body, not just observe it. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch identified bacteria as causes of disease. The theory of humors collapsed under the weight of evidence. Blood was no longer something to balance, it was something to preserve. And so, leeches, once medical marvels, became outdated. Their sudden fall from grace was swift. Hospitals stopped ordering them. Apothecaries removed them from shelves. Collectors lost their only buyers. What happened to the collectors? In many cases, they simply vanished from the records. Without formal employment or guilds, leech collectors had no pensions, no protections, no backup plan. Some took up other work, cleaning, foraging, selling herbal cures, laundry. Others were too old or ill from decades of cold water and infection. One Welsh collector, in a letter dated 1891, wrote, "The ponds are gone, sir. All pipes now. No room for my sort." Progress had arrived, but it left behind the women who fed it. The leech in popular culture. As the medical use of leeches faded, they became symbols of backwardness in newspapers and satire monsters in Victorian penny dreadfuls, villains in literature. Leech, it became a metaphor for those who drained other specimens in jars. displayed in museums with a sense of horror or morbid fascination, and yet fascination remained. Children poked them with sticks and streams. Old doctors kept dried ones in drawers. Folk healers whispered that the old way still worked for those who believed. A medical tool had become myth, and then a return. In the late 20th century, something surprising happened. Leeches made a small comeback. Modern surgeons discovered that leeches could reduce venous congestion after skin grafts, improve blood flow, and reattached fingers or ears prevent blood clots where delicate veins were too small to stitch their saliva. Hirudin was found to be an effective anticoagulant once again. The leech had a role, but now it came in sterile packaging from controlled breeding farms, handled with gloves, tracked with barcodes, used by specialists. No mud, no barefoot collector, no ponds. Just science, the ghost in the marsh still. Something lingers. In the shallows of certain English streams. Leeches remain wild, slow, waiting, and once in a while, an old woman, now a rarity herself, remembers the work she recalls. The chill of morning, the hiss of the reed beds, the strange silence of water teeming with unseen life, a sting, and the weight of blood that wasn't quite hers. Not every legacy is written in books, some live in the skin. Final reflections. The story of the leech collector isn't just about strange medicine, that's about the people. History doesn't record the barefoot women who bled for medicine, the invisible labor behind every elegant cure, the belief, passed from hand to hand, that healing must hurt, and it's a reminder that for most of human history, progress was built not in labs or palaces, but in ponds. In quiet pain. In hands no one ever thought to name. Tonight, we walk by lamplight, not through fields or swamps, but through graveyards. The air is cold, the grass is damp, and somewhere nearby a spade bites softly into the earth. This isn't a robbery, not in the traditional sense. It's a job. A grim, illegal, and absolutely necessary one, because in the 18th century, medicine needed something it couldn't get through proper channels, bodies, and the only people willing to get them worked by night. They were called resurrectionists, not because they raised the dead, but because they dug them up. So if you're ready, grab your lantern, pull your cloak tight, and tread softly, because we're about to disturb the rest of the recently departed. The night trade, why corpses were more valuable than gold. Let's begin in Edinburgh. Around the year 1805. At the city's Royal College of Surgeons, a medical student stares down at a pale, exposed body. He is nervous. This is his first time performing a dissection, not just of an arm or a leg, but a full human body. His instructor guides his hand, steadying the scalpel. Be gentle, the older man says. This one cost us dearly. The student nods. He does not ask where the body came from. He already knows. The shortage of legal bodies by the 18th century. Medical schools in Britain, Ireland, and parts of Europe were expanding rapidly. Anatomy had become central to medical training. Students needed real cadavers for practice, but legal sources of bodies were extremely limited under English law. Only executed criminals could be dissecated. A number of executions had dropped sharply. Medical demand far exceeded the lawful supply. Some cities had dozens of students, and only 1 or 2 legal corpses per year, so doctors looked elsewhere, and a new profession was born. Who were the resurrectionists? They went by many names. Resurrectionists, body snatchers, grave robbers, less kindly Sekemah men in London. Slang they were, often working-class men, former gravediggers, butchers, or laborers paid by the head. Not the hour, fast, quiet, and well-practiced. They were not interested in jewelry or coffins, only the body itself, clean, fresh, preferably within 24 to 72 hours of burial. How a body was stolen. A typical resurrection went like this. Choose the target, recent burial, shallow grave, minimal surveillance, arrive late at night, often after midnight, dig quickly only at the head of the grave break. The coffin lid, use a rope or hook to drag the body out, refill the earth to leave no trace. Strip. The corpse clothes were legally considered property, delivered to a medical school. By morning, payment depended on condition and rarity. Pregnant women, deformities, or the very young were highly valued. A single corpse could bring in more than a month's wages for a laborer. The secrecy of the market. Most medical schools looked the other way. They didn't ask, the resurrectionists didn't tell. The deliveries were made before dawn. At back entrances, bodies arrived in sacks, crates, or even whiskey barrels. Money was paid in cash, no receipts, no names. Some institutions even had coded knock patterns, and some surgeons kept resurrection money on hand ready for the next delivery. It was an open secret, necessary, illegal, and mostly tolerated. Public outrage, but outside the world of medicine, people were horrified. To the average citizen, the idea of grave robbing was unthinkable. Most believed the body had to remain whole for resurrection. At Judgment Day, desecrating the dead was seen as a violation of both law and faith. Families went to great lengths to protect graves. Heavy stones, iron cages called mortsefeswan, with dogs, coffin torpedoes, yes, actual spring-loaded traps. And when resurrectionists were caught, they were mobbed, beaten, and occasionally killed. But few were formally prosecuted, because, officially, there was no crime called body snatching. The law protected property, not corpses. And so, the trade continued. A resurrectionist's life, it was not glamorous. Resurrection ISTS worked in mud in freezing rain under constant threat of discovery. They carried shovels, pickaxes, crowbars, tarpaulins, 2 muffle sound ropes, sacks, oilcloth for wrapping corpses, bribes for night watchmen. They often stank of decay, were shunned by neighbors, and drank heavily to dull the sights they saw. And yet, many returned night after night because the money was good, and demand never stopped. So what does it say about a society that healing the living depended on stealing from the dead? And what happens when education demands silence, secrecy, and a spade? Flesh and justice, medical ethics, public rage, and the business of the dead. It's a foggy night in 1828, and 2 men enter a boarding house in Edinburgh. One carries a bottle of gin, the other carries a body. But this corpse isn't from a grave, it's fresh, warm, even. There's no spade, no shovel, just 2 men, and a plan far darker than grave-robbing. The market grows and darkens by the early 1800s. Demand for cadavers that had never been higher. London and Edinburgh were centers of medical training. Thousands of students required hands-on experience. Only a few dozen legal corpses were available per year. The result: resurrectionists became organized. Some formed networks across cities, others bribed gravediggers, clergy, or hospital porters. Few created fake funerals with empty coffins to distract from real thefts. Medical schools relied on them. Some professed. The record kept favorite resurrectionists on retainer. But this also raised a new question. What if stealing from the grave wasn't enough? What if someone took a shortcut? Burke and Hare, the most infamous case in Edinburgh. William Burke and William Hare discovered a loophole in the resurrection trade. They didn't rob graves, they murdered the living. Their victims were often poor, elderly, alcoholic, and likely to be missed. 10 months they killed at least 16 people, delivering each corpse to Dr. Robert Knox, a respected anatomy lecturer. Knox paid in cash, asked few questions, and used the bodies for teaching. Eventually, suspicion grew. A suspicious bruising, a lodger's sudden disappearance, and anonymous tip. The men were arrested. Hare turned state's witness. Burke was hanged and dissected publicly. His skeleton still exists in a medical museum today. Knox was never charged, but public outrage exploded. The panic over the dead. The Burke and Hare case confirmed the public's worst fears. Doctors weren't just using corpses, they might be creating them suddenly. Graves were guarded at night. Riots broke out near medical schools. Watchmen were armed. Surgeons were attacked in the streets. Pamphlets and broadsheets spread lurid tales. Anatomists, they feast on the flesh of the forgotten. Your mother may be next. Even legitimate resurrectionists became targets, because who could be trusted anymore? The surgeon's dilemma. Doctors found themselves caught between ethics and education. Many argued dissection was essential in understanding anatomy. Saved lives. Students couldn't learn from drawings or models, but others warned that turning a blind eye. 2 resurrectionists risked public trust. That the profession's future relied on transparency, not secrecies. Some tried to source bodies legally, requesting unclaimed paupers from workhouses or prisons, but these efforts were too little. Too late, the scandal had poisoned public opinion. The Anatomy Act of 1832. In response to growing outrage, the British Parliament passed the Anatomy Act. It did 3 key things: legalized dissection of unclaimed bodies from hospitals, workhouses, and prisons, ended the need for body snatching, required medical schools to be licensed and supervised. The act was supposed to restore dignity to the dead, to the doctors, and to the profession, but it came with a cost. The poor, the homeless, and the institutionalized became the default donors. Consent was rarely sought, families were rarely notified. Rich buried their dead in guarded plots. The poor were buried in classrooms. The resurrectionists fade away with the passing of the act. Resurrectionists lost their income. The trade collapsed almost overnight. Some turned to crime, others disappeared from the record entirely. What remained was a silence. Doctors didn't speak of the days before. 1,832 students didn't ask, and the stories of the men who once dug graves by moonlight. They were left behind, buried, this time for good. So when the law finally changed, was it justice, or just a cleaner system, built on the same bones? And what does it mean when the cost of learning is someone else's rest? Bones and memory, what we did with the dead, and what they left behind. Let's begin not in a graveyard, but in a quiet university anatomy hall. The year is 2023. A group of students stand around a donated body. It lies on a metal table, draped in linen. A name tag rests nearby. A small card reads, "This person gave their body to science. Please show respect." The room is bright, sterile, almost reverent, but not long ago, less than 200 years, this same practice happened in secret, in basements, in back alleys, in rooms full of sweat, gaslight, and guilt, and the people on the table never consented. What happened to the stolen bodies? Records are scarce, but some trends are clear. Most bodies stolen by resurrectionists were used quickly, dissected over several days. Then discarded remains were often burned, buried in mass graves, or simply disposed of quietly. Medical schools kept no names, no ledgers, and certainly no memorials. The dead became anonymous tools. No rites, no headstones, no mourning. Just anatomy. Bones in the basement in some institutions. Remnants remain. In London, Renovations of old medical buildings have uncovered bones hidden in walls, skulls buried beneath floorboards, and femurs mislabeled as teaching aids in Edinburgh. Fragments of skeletons believed to be Burke's victims were discovered decades later mixed among preserved specimens in Cambridge and Oxford. Professors quietly donated entire collections of historical remains to museums, unsure of how they were acquired. There was no way to trace them, and no easy way to honor them. So many were simply reburied quietly. One final silence. The rise of medical ethics in the wake of the Anatomy Act and the horrors it revealed. Medical ethics slowly evolved. Informed consent became a pillar of medical practice. Bodies used for study had to be willed willingly. Through signed forms, institutions began holding memorial services for donors, attended by staff and students. Some medical schools created memorial plaques for unknown bodies dissected in the past. Still, these gestures came decades or centuries too late for those taken during the Resurrectionist era. Their stories were never told, until now. The Resurrectionist in memory. Resurrectionists are villains in novels, creepy footnotes in museum exhibits, Halloween costumes and cautionary tales, but the truth is stranger. They were desperate, poor, often non-violent, participating in a market created by silence. They didn't steal for thrills. They dug because someone asked them to, because a surgeon needed a body, because a student needed to pass his exam, because science needed flesh, so they gave it by taking it. Memorials that never came. Imagine a city square with no statue, no plaque, just grass where once wagons full of the dead rolled by before dawn, a university laboratory with polished equipment, but no mention of the names that were taken. Some institutions are beginning to reckon with this. In 2021, the University of Edinburgh issued a formal apology for the school's historic use of illegally obtained borders in Dublin. A small ceremony was held for unnamed anatomical remains once buried in school courtyards in Boston. Some museums now note some remains in this collection may have been acquired unethically. These are gestures, but they cannot undo the theft. They can only acknowledge it. Final reflections. The story of the Resurrectionists isn't just about crime. It's about the cost of learning and who pays it. It reminds us that progress, even scientific, is rarely clean. That behind every textbook diagram of a muscle or bone, there is a shadow. And that the greatest gift the dead can offer the living, knowledge, should only ever be given, never taken. So next time you pass a medical school or hospital, consider this. Not every building was built on land alone. Some were built on silence, and on the backs of the forgotten. Asterisk.